Hey everybody, welcome to Hell Talk. I'm Matt, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Hoku.
Hi, everyone.
And today we are joined by a very special guest, the writer of Hellblazer issues 89 to 128, Wolverine Origin, Marvel Knights Inhumans, The Sentry, just to name a few. Please welcome. We're very excited to talk to Paul Jenkins.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Yay!
Yay.
We are very good. I hope you are well. Man, the first thing I have to ask is how did you find this podcast and why did you reach out?
Um, it's interesting. I really just got into podcasts, and there's a few that I listen to, but not many, and I can't remember what happened. I think it might have been a suggestion, and I don't know why that suggestion came up because I don't know that I particularly go looking for comic book podcasts of any kind. I don't listen to any. But you guys kind of came across the stream in whichever way it does, and I was like, oh, that's funny. There's a whole Hellblazer one, and then I couldn't believe that you had decided in probably a very weak moment in your life to go
Yes.
through every single issue of Hellblazer, which seems like a tragic decision, but good for you. And so I was like, well, okay, cool. And then I realized you were doing what seems quite popular in some ways, which is going through every issue and kind of reading it and telling the story of it, to people and letting them use their imaginations, which I quite liked. And then I came upon your Hell Talk thing that you guys did, and I was like, oh wow, okay, they're talking about the books. I'll listen, to see what they were thinking and how they approached it. And I found it really interesting because a lot of what you said was very insightful as a writer. You're trying to work out if you're providing the right information. Sometimes I would listen to it and think that was something I didn't think about. That was a clever insight. And other times I'd be like, man, these guys have got it completely wrong. What have I done?
Well, that's awesome. I'm glad the algorithm it probably like linked onto your name and was like, "Oh, this is another like cuz I mention your name a couple times, when I say who the writer is for every issue." So maybe it was like Paul Jenkins, I don't know. Um but okay, so with that, if what were the big things like that you I don't know, thought that we got wrong and right, and I don't know. That's I'm
Let's put
interested.
it out there first. Like, where did we get wrong?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I don't really want to bring out. It would be nice to go through my run on Hellblazer a little bit to give you a sense of like what was happening to
Awesome.
me as a
Right.
person,
Yeah,
and
and
to give.
also we read the end of your back matter of the omnibus that
Yeah.
just came out, everybody. So if you like Paul Jenkins'
It's
run,
so cool.
it's
Oh my gosh.
amazing. Check out that omnibus. But he put a breakdown of each issue and what he was going through in his life and how that tied to it. It's one of the coolest things I've ever read. I was like, this should be on every writer's big masterwork because I learned so much about the run of Hellblazer just from what was going on with you. So I
Yeah.
And
loved
your
that.
life with all the photos that you shared and like pre-sketches, a few like storyboards. I mean, there was so much information there that really helped us to understand a lot more about each individual story, about your run in general. But yeah, I mean, we'd love to like just dive into it.
Yeah, I think the first thing to talk about is how I became the writer of Hellblazer and how I broke into this business as a writer in a way that nobody else that I have ever met has done. Or could he, or in a way that most people would say there's no way you can break into comics as a writer that way.
Well, and when I read you put how you broke into comics, your comic book story I told someone was kind of like the Forrest Gump of like comic book story writing stories
Yeah.
because it's like I was at this moment when these people who were the biggest people, were doing their thing and I became friends with them and then it just kind of escalates to you're at every like pivotal moment in the comics industry from the 80s on. So
Yeah. So I had come over to the States and I was teaching music and drama to learning disabled kids, and I'd studied to be an actor. And most of the time, when
Oh.
I was studying to be an actor, I wanted to work in film. So I spent most of my time down learning like film and working towards creatively like writing or directing or both. And so I got a job over here, and I came over and I was chasing a girl in Massachusetts. You know, I went up to Massachusetts, and but I played in a band called Grave Goods. And Grave Goods, you know, we were doing okay. We opened one time for Jane's Addiction. We were playing in the Northeast a little bit. You know, we played in a lot of really cool clubs and stuff around the Northeast. All the ones you need to play, right? And I met a couple of guys that had a black and white comic book called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And
just a couple of random guys.
As right? You do.
And they were part of Mirage Studios, and they did an album cover for my band, which is sitting about, I found it the other day, it's sitting about 10 yards away from me, and when we're finished with this, I'll show it to you.
Awesome.
Yay!
It's pretty cool. So they did this album cover, and at the time, you know, and I'd always been a soccer player, right? I played all the time. But I would break ankles and break stuff constantly. And one day I broke my ankle. And when you're a musician, it means that you're waiting on tables or you're working in a hardware store. And I was like, well, I'm not going to be able to play with a band for a while. I'm not going to be able to do anything. So I went upstairs from the place I was waiting tables called the Iron Horse Cafe, which is this legendary cafe in Northampton, Massachusetts, where everybody who is famous plays in this little cafe, right? It's the most amazing venue. And I had met a couple of people that were involved with Ninja Turtles, right? I go upstairs and I say, you guys need anyone to help you? Because I know that you just had the TV show up. And they were like, yeah, we're so busy. This is ridiculous. Do you want to come work with us? I'm like, yeah, man, I need a job. And so I started working with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I was 22. And I had no background in it. I, as you now know, I didn't grow up with comics because we didn't have any money, right? And we had 2 or 3 comics, and they were mostly black and white reprints of EC comics from America. So they were like horror comics and science fiction comics. Ooh. And that was it. And then we had 2000 AD in Britain, and I definitely liked that. I could see that and get that book. So I started working with them, and next thing you know, it was the Ninja Turtles. Obviously, it blew up. I was in the middle of it. Next thing you know, I'm moving on from Mirage Studios because I wasn't really into the money side of it. I think everybody was really crazy about how much money was flowing in, and I didn't like it. And I was very friendly with Kevin Eastman, one of the 2 creators. And I like, you know, Pete and I got on just fine. But Kevin said to me, look, I'm opening a new publishing company that's really for the benefit of creators, and I would love it if you wanted to come over. I said, I would love to, man, because, you know, I really don't like the way the money is just making everything crazy. It's miserable. I didn't grow up with money, so I wasn't missing anything. Like, I'd never been a millionaire, so I wasn't missing not being a millionaire, you know? And so I went over with him, and I became the editor-in-chief at probably the age of 24 of Tundra Publishing, which we published Alan Moore, Steve Bissett, Dave McKean, Neil Gaiman. You know, we had everybody.
Yeah.
And I was an editor over there, the editor-in-chief. I was also the head of production. I was also brought my licensing knowledge from the Ninja Turtles and any licensing that we could potentially do. So now I was Alan Moore's editor on Big Numbers and From Hell.
Which just amazing. A few low creators, you know, you've never heard of them.
You know, and that's what's so crazy about it. And I had done it for a while, and it's a legendary story, the story of Tundra Publishing. You know, all the money got lost and so on and so forth. And the behavior of some creators was terrible, but Alan was lovely. He's a really nice guy. And I got on with him quite well. And I would always say this in interviews. People ask me, like, what's he like? You know, is he like a wizard guy? And he's not. He does it like, I know he does it publicly. And he's very, very intelligent guy. But usually I would call him up and I would say, hey, Alan, it's Paul Jenkins. And he'd always say the same thing every time. Hello, Paul. All right? You just normally chat with him.
Just casual.
So he and I were quite friendly, and I was lucky enough to work with him and Eddie Campbell and you know, Dave McKean and loads of people right around the world. Rick Veitch, Steve Bissett. And I moved on from there and I became the editor-in-chief of a company called Majestic in Cincinnati. So now I'm about 26 and I've moved on through 3 companies. Now I'm an editor-in-chief of a company. I'm in the comic industry peripherally because I've been involved in it this way, right? But it was, very different. It certainly wasn't mainstream. And I flew over to England. Let's see, I think it was about 1993 that I flew over to England and I was talking to Alan to see if he would come do a book at Majestic, which was never going to happen, right? And at the time, we were reminiscing about Big Numbers because Big Numbers was, I don't know if you guys have ever really had this discussion about Alan's work outside of sort of Hellblazer, but Big Numbers was a legendary book. And actually, obviously, we're able to see each other in this conversation. And there's Big Numbers right there. That's one of the unpublished pages of book 3 that never came out. Ooh. And I have half of the book because it gave me a bleeding stomach ulcer when I was 24. Bill Sienkiewicz and I still remain very good friends. But, it put me through the ringer. And so I was talking to Alan, and Alan brought out this incredible chart that he had. So Big Numbers is 12 issues, and there were all these characters, and it was this big square chart where he charted the journey of each character along the chart, so you could see what happened in 1, 2, 3, 4. Now that book was about fractal mathematics. It was about causality, cause and effect. It was a really complicated book. But there was this guy who I know it's fair to kind of describe Alan as a genius guy, because he's a super nice, ordinary guy to me, but his brain is definitely on a level that's quite high. And I'm looking at this chart and I was struck by this notion. And I said, Alan, the craziest thing about seeing this chart and seeing how clever you are is, why am I kind of about to say something weird? I think this way about storytelling. And I'm not a storyteller. I don't write. I'm editing. But I'm looking at American comics. I live in America now, and I see like superhero comics. I'm like, man, why are they such crap? They're awful. And they're terrible. I don't get it. Like, what's the point of reading these bloody things? They're like toilet paper. And he's like, yeah, they're shit, And and so, we're having this conversation, and I said, Alan, I kind of get what you're saying, like you're structuring it, right? I said, but, it's probably kind of learning how to be a filmmaker and learning how to structure stories and studying English as part of what I did in college and all that. I understand and care about structure. So I said to him, mate, do you think I should give it a shot? And he's like, why not? So
go for it.
Everything that happens
motivation
next
you needed, right?
Right. Everything that happens next is Alan Moore's fault.
Okay. So blame him if there's something we didn't like.
Alan. So if you don't like my work, go find Alan. So I sort of left Britain and I came back to the States, and then there was San Diego that year, and I thought, well, I always go down to San Diego. I've been going for 3 or 4 years now with Tundra and with Earth, so I'll go down and I'll see, what's what, right? And I get down there and someone tells me that the editor of Hellblazer, and this is going to be a recurring theme for you guys, so you're about to find out like the way that it works for me. The editor of Hellblazer, Lou Stathis, has had Eddie Campbell come on to Hellblazer, which I'm sure you guys went through the Eddie Campbell series before I came on. And Eddie doesn't want to do it anymore. I think he, wasn't working out somehow. And so now Lou is looking for a new writer. So I go over to Lou and I say, hey, Lou, Paul Jenkins, nice to meet you. I understand you're looking for a new writer for Hellblazer. Can I try out for it? And he said, well, what have you written? And I said, I've not written anything.
Nothing.
And so he let me try out for it.
Did you name drop Alan at least? Is that
no?
No. Okay.
No, I wouldn't do that. I don't think I didn't.
Okay.
No, I just asked him if he would. But I think you have to look back at 1993, right? They Karen Berger knew of me because I worked at Tundra, so it's not like we wouldn't know each other sort of like socially. And I was, 27 at this point, whatever. And I played soccer about 5 times a week. I was really fit. I didn't have an ounce of fat on me. I had bleach blonde hair, fucking leather jacket, wearing it around San Diego. I was literally John Constantine. and they let me try out, and they put me through my paces. I'd have to look and see if I can find my original test script for Hellblazer. I may be able to find it. I don't know if it's in my Hellblazer file. It's probably in a file that's so old that you can't read it on Microsoft Word anymore.
Was that test script what ended up being like Critical Mass or your first? No, it was just
that was a made up script. It was literally just me writing a story that I thought of about John Constantine. I don't even remember what it was about, to be honest, Matt.
Okay.
And so I wrote it, and then he gave me some notes, and it was things like, I'm literally a neophyte. He's like, hey, can you, instead of making bullet points, can you make each thing a panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, because you're just writing bullet points? And I went, yeah, okay, is that how it's done? And I kind of wrote some stuff. And 6 weeks later, after I first sent in the first draft, they called me up and he said, congratulations, you're the new writer of Hellblazer.
That's amazing.
And
That's crazy.
I had no idea what I had done. No sense of it. I was of a mind that I sort of I kind of remember it very clearly, actually. I remember exactly where I was when he called me, which room I was sitting in my house. And he calls me up, and I went sort of, oh, cool, okay, cool, man, yeah, brilliant. Because I was like, well, that's what I tried to do, and so I did it.
And it worked, and that's exactly what you needed. So
yeah.
That's amazing. I had a question because I kind of read some of this story in your back matter, and I was wondering, what do you think contributed to your specific success as far as like an attribute that you bring to the table? Because people can BS their way into jobs, but to keep them and also do a good job enough to write Hellblazer for almost 40 issues or actually maybe even over 40 issues. What do you think? Is it just that you're a quick learner and you do the job well, or what do you think it is?
It's a great question. If someone ever says to me, because I'm quite a prolific writer and I work on a lot of different stuff, and I can go from, I work in games and I work in animation and I work in film and television. I work across different media, right? And I'm one of the few people that does all the different types of things that I do, because most people that work across a lot of those don't do games, for example, but I do lots of them, right? And if someone tells me I'm talented, I'm always a bit like, for Pete's sake, okay, sure, thanks. Because I don't need it. I don't need my ego stroked, and I don't think that people understand what talent is. I think talent is just potential, unless you add hard work. But I'm a really hardworking person. So if someone ever says to me, man, you're a really hardworking guy, I'm always like, thank you. I'm glad you see that, as opposed to thinking that what I do is I just type and watch football on TV, because that's what talented people do. They just type and it comes out easily. No, it doesn't. And so when I'm working on a screenplay and it's the 17th night in a row that I've been awake at 4:00 in the morning and no one's sitting with me, I'm doing it. I'm the one that's putting all the effort into it, and I've got a neck ache and I'm going back over page 76 of a screenplay because I think I might have made a mistake. No one does that except me. You live as an island by yourself. So I think that what it probably was is growing up the way I did and knowing that I had been taking care of myself since I was about 11. I was just like this self-motivated, hard-working person. So when it came time to learn how to write comics, I was like, I suppose I better learn how to write comics now because I've got a comic job.
Yeah.
And that's what I did.
That's awesome. Yeah, I kind of thought that's what it was, because I think that's the only way that actually works. I think we lost Hoku for a second, but she'll jump back in. But yeah, I kind of relate to the talent thing. You see over here, I got a drum set. I played drums all my life, and people would always say, "Oh, you're so talented." And I'm like, no. I put so many hours into practicing this thing.
Yeah, they would say, when you're a drummer, I play music, and you get to a point when you've practiced enough that you can go off and do some things. As a drummer, for example, you might do some trills and some stuff, and you may work out just a new way of sort of like coming in on a beat or coming in on off beat or something like that you just thought of. And that's because you've done it so many times that now you can experiment and now you can work out how to do it. So it looks easy, but of course, I think that people who have some kind of accomplishment creatively are probably a bit like swans, right? Like on top, it looks great, but underneath they're paddling furiously.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So one of the things that I thought might be worth actually kind of mentioning to you guys is I found it really interesting when you guys were talking about often I would find it interesting that you guys were talking about what their intent was, right? So you're talking about me and DC as if there's some coordinated plan that we had for the character, and especially any kind of coordinated plan for the first 2 issues that I did that were set in Australia, right? There was no plan whatsoever. Eddie Campbell had left him in Australia, and Lou said to me, you've got to write 2 issues in Australia and get him back to Great Britain, because that's where he is right now. And I went, I guess I'm a professional writer now. I got to work out a way to write this stuff. And so I had to think, and I had to research the Dreamtime that I had heard of. It was kind of, the Dreamtime was like the impetus behind George Lucas's Force in Star Wars. It was like this when he said this whole thing about it binds and penetrates you, it's like that's how native Australian Aborigines believe that the Dreamtime works. It's right near us. It's like a dimension that is part of our life. And so I did this research and I understood a little bit, but I was diligent and I got in touch with some people from like a specific place with Australian history. And I wrote to them and I said, hey, can you help me out? I got to write a story, but I want to do this. And they set me right, which I've always been really good at research and making sure I do it the right way. And once I had a buy-in, I wrote that story, but it didn't come from any plan whatsoever. Nobody at DC or Eddie Campbell or me had planned for those stories in Australia. It was, you got to solve a problem. You're stuck in Australia, get him home.
That's amazing. We had this whole speculation, what was happening behind the scenes, and it was just
Remind me of your speculation if you remember it. I remember you talking about it, and I was thinking, man, they're so far off.
It was basically like, okay, maybe just Eddie Campbell's filling in, and he wanted to write this Australia story, and then they're like, oh, Paul Jenkins is coming next.
Yep.
Or actually, it was you knowing that there was going to be Eddie Campbell writing a 4-issue series was like, hey, Eddie, would you mind setting him up in Australia because I need to use the Dreamtime in my run. And that's what I thought. That's what I was like.
We basically thought you were the mastermind.
I remember you guys talking about that, and I thought it was very amusing because it was as if I had said, hey, listen, I can only start in 4 issues time. Yeah. And it was a whole plan for me to start. And in fact, what happened was that Eddie quit after 4 issues, and they were like, shit, we need a writer who we're going to get.
That's amazing. I like that we have like this whole history we made up just to try to figure that out, but... Yeah.
Now you guys did that frequently, and it was one of the reasons why I reached out to you, Matt, because I enjoyed it because I was like, it's interesting because I'm not cracking on you guys. Like, you don't know, right? You're just kind of speculating and you're kind of getting with, you're seeing what you think is happening. And presumably you're kind of inferring, well, maybe DC works this way and they've got some plan. Let me tell you this. We didn't have a plan, man. We didn't know.
Yeah, I think, I've heard other stories from, maybe it's because it's Vertigo, so it's different. There's not as, there's a certain like leeway they give people, but I just, from my, I don't know, other comic book stories I've heard, it's like, oh, we're planning this 2 years ahead, so this person's taking over, and it just seems more like, maybe that's what they do now. Maybe it's a little more loosey-goosey back in the 90s, I don't know, but
I think what's really funny to me, and I'll never know the answer to this because obviously, sadly, Lou Stathis departed the world. Oh, sorry.
It's okay. it was very touching what you wrote of him, by the way, in the book. That was like me and Hoku both were like, that was heartbreaking. Everything about that. So
Yeah, he don't get over it. It was very sad. He left in the middle of my run. He got brain cancer, so it was very tough. But what I was going to say is that Lou had been a music guy. He had been a music reporter, I think, and at 27 years old, I looked like Sting on the front cover of Outlandos de Moore, Regatta de Blanc. I looked exactly like Sting. And I had bleach blonde hair that at this point isn't bleach blonde. It's just kind of white, and it's great, right? I didn't really have to change my hairstyle. It would naturally fill in bleach blonde, And so, I think that Lou and Karen there was an additional positive, and it goes back to your question, and we've gone round in a circle, and I'm actually answering the question you asked me, which is why me? And part of it, right, is that you got to look at, I can't speak for Jamie. I can't speak for Garth, except that I know that Jamie was very interested in writing about politics and political kind of material. Garth was a child of Northern Ireland, who railed against Catholicism in his life and in his work. But I was a child of the West Country of England, and I grew up living in the magic. I lived inside the magic. That was my life. And so, as you now know, Rich the Punk is my brother. Michelle is my sister-in-law. Cider is now 35 years old, 36. Ivy's 33. All of my mates, like they were all there. So I grew up, half of those stories are places that I grew up. And then of course, what happens? They give me the job. I field the phone call. Lou tells me, congratulations. I'm like, great. I'm sort of excited, because it's not like I took it in my stride only. I was like, this is great. And 2 or 3 hours after they told me I was a new writer of Hellblazer, I got a phone call, and my mate Deanie had been killed in a crash. Mm. He'd hit head on. It was the previous night, and he and this other lady they were just really tired at 4 o'clock in the morning. There was no alcohol involved, and they went across the median and they smashed each other head on. And now I've got the best news, and now suddenly my mate's dead. And he was a good friend, and I'm trying to process all of this stuff that's happening in my life. I have no idea what's happening at that point. I'm trying to professionally write a story in Australia. I know what I want to write about, which is the magic of the British countryside from where I grew up. And now my mate Deanie's dead. And so you can imagine at that moment, I'm just, my head's on a swivel.
Yeah, that would be very intense to have that news, like the juxtaposition of that good news and the bad news all at once.
Yeah.
That honestly, I was wondering about this because since you were a new comic book writer and having seen what Alan Moore did with his like planning out of the whole run he was going to do on Big Numbers, and were you like a month to month writer, like so you could pivot, like if something happened like with Deanie, you could just let me write this issue. Wasn't planned or anything, but I'm going to throw that in. Or were you like, I know what's going to happen at the end, but let's get there? Or how did you write this?
I think if my memory serves, I knew what I wanted to write in Critical Mass. I was like, I think I've got an idea, right? If you look at my career, you'll find that I'm a holdover from a simpler time, maybe because I love single issues. Mm-hmm. And I think they're a lost art. And I think that the comic industry even now needs way more of them. And I used to do them in Spider-Man. I used to do them in Hellblazer. I used to do them in the Hulk. I've done single issues. Even when I first went to go work at Marvel and we did the Inhumans, I did 12 single issues stacked on top of each other to make a story, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
But I did have like an idea of a 5-issue kind of story called Critical Mass that brings back the First of the Fallen, that gives us a chance to establish a crew that gives us the things, right? And I also knew that I was going to write about what I knew, because I wasn't going to write about what I read about. I was going to write about the things that I lived. You must understand how weird it probably is for me to tell people this, and it's weird to hear. But at 11 years old, I was fucking feral, right? I used to go up to London by myself on the tube, or be in London at my grandparents' house, because my mum is, as you know, not quite all there, right? And so she didn't know what we were doing. And my brother was 14. We lived in a port town for a while in Weymouth in Dorset. So there were drugs coming in. My brother was working as a carny at 14 years old. He wasn't going to school. Mum, when I was like 6, 7, 8, 9, mum would disappear and then come back. Or she'd have us living in a student commune. We have social services coming after us all the time. We're traveling. We're sleeping in a caravan. We're sleeping, frankly, homeless a couple of times. And so that understanding of like what kind of weirdness this must be for me to even tell people, I'm like, you have no idea. If I'm in a club in London watching some band, in 1977, 78, that could be the Police or Dire Straits playing for the first time, or pick one, Pink Military, or the Ruts, or the Mekons, or the Dickies, or the Plasmatics. Like all of those people, all punk had hit. And I'm 11 years old. I got red, white, and blue hair. I don't give a shit. My brother doesn't give a shit. And we're traveling around. I'm going up on the train. I'm bunking on the train everywhere I go. I'm going to see Crystal Palace Football Club, and then getting out and getting in for free, getting out, never paying for anything, getting in trouble all the time, and I got in trouble for breaking into cars at one point with my mate Ian Fox, and we were going to get taken away, right? The social services came around for the 900th time and sort of went. And one of my teachers was very helpful to my mum, who is a brilliant person. My mum is a genius person. She's still with us. She's 87 years old. She's the most unique human being you've ever met. So maybe this will also help you guys understand what is behind Hellblazer. And I want to put everybody listening to this in like a frame of mind to understand where Hellblazer on my run can come from, because you may be brought up in chaos, but there may also be these incredible creative opportunities that are part of your life as a child. As a child, we didn't have any electricity. I remember living in, and I wrote this in the back, I remember living in a farm cottage for a while with no electricity. And so we'd have these massive storms that would come across, and you could tell how far away they were by counting them. I slept in an attic. Right, that's the space that we had, and I was terrified of the dark. And you'd see the lightning, and you go 1, 2, 3, boom. Okay, it's 3 miles away, and it would just come on top of you. You could look out of the window and see the farmhouse and see the lights blazing. So if you have ever seen the origin of Wolverine and seen the first scene where the kid is at the bottom of the hill looking at the lights blazing, that's how I grew up. I was Dog at the bottom of the hill, and what the magic that my mum brought to our lives, we couldn't afford a bus fare, but we went to school with a bunch of kids who were kind of gentrified farmers' children who had money, and they didn't realize that me and my brother were the very gypsies that they didn't like and they complained about all the time. So we would walk 2 miles to school, I think, and we would see stoats and weasels and badgers and foxes and all of the stuff. We lived the magic. We understood where the stones were. We knew where to walk to Leeds Castle. We took every path. And it never left us. It never left my brother. It never left me. So we now were the kings of England. We were the kids that were from that country. And that's what I wrote into Hellblazer was, the lore that you see me write was about walking to school in a rainstorm and having kids that were on the, supposed to be on the bus from 2 stops away, not come to school because they didn't want to. But here comes the Jenkins boys traipsing over we always did. and coming home on a Friday night and having my mum go, okay, you come with me. And we're like, now what? And we'd walk up to the top to this main road, and she'd stick her thumb out and we'd go hitchhiking for 3 days. Nowhere to go, nowhere to stay, nobody that we would meet. We would just literally go and find someone and ask them if we could stay at their house. But I remember things like having her take us on that hitchhiking trip one time, and we ended up meeting a couple of students that were like stoners, and they had a mongoose. And so we hung out, and this mongoose was called Mongi, and I would hang out with this mongoose and play with it a little bit. Like, so you've got chaos, but you've also got magic, and it's part of your life. And so what else could I be but a writer, I think?
Yeah, and it seems like that kind of fits into Hellblazer too, because you got like this, this magical side that you were aware of from just your upbringing and whatnot. And I think even like Hoku mentioned, she had a question about the Jack of the Green, right? Hoku?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is he sort of like a version of the Green Man?
He's a green man.
He is a Green Man.
So we grew up, my brother and I grew up knowing that if you look in trees, if you look long enough, it's a bit like the Dreamtime. If you remember in the first Dreamtime story that if you blow to a didgeridoo and you stand by a waterfall, after a while you lose the breath from your body a little bit, and you start to get a little lightheaded, and that's when you sense the Dreamtime, the other waterfall and the rainbow serpent and all that, right? In the green, in England, if you stare long enough, it's a little bit like staring at your own face in a mirror. You know, when you do that and you just stand there and you look at yourself, you look at your own eyes and you begin to lose yourself. You can look into the foliage and find a foliate face. Jack is always looking at you somewhere. So he's all around you. And that stuff was part of the way that we grew. You know, we knew that Jack was there all the time.
That's
so
awesome.
My mum would tell us the story. We didn't have a TV because we didn't have a TV, but she would read The Hobbit, and she would let me read The Hobbit with her. That's kind of like this cool thing, right? But she would tell us stories. When you are in the countryside in England, you don't hear anything, because in America you hear cicadas and you hear all of the noise because it's so warm, right? In Britain, it's completely silent, and then you'll hear a crack, and that'll be a fox, and then you hear a hoot, and that'll be an owl. And so you end up feeling very connected to every piece of magic that's around you. And because it's so silent, and because there are so many villages, there's a belief that the village that moves, which I called Aberton, but it moves, and so you can never catch it. Like, it's like trying to catch the bottom of the rainbow, but if you do, everyone that's magic in Britain lives there. And then we believed it. We knew that it was true, I suppose, you know?
That's very cool. I had never heard. I think a lot of maybe my misunderstanding of some of the stuff from your run was because I was not familiar with a lot of that lore that you just grew up with and you were putting in it. I had no idea about. I didn't even know about the Green Man or anything. So the closest I had was Swamp Thing. So
right.
I lived in England for a few years, and I remember the Green Man was everywhere. So I was like, it has to be connected to him.
Yeah, Jack in the Green was the Green Man, basically. He was the foliate face that was always there. And he, one of the things I'll tell you about in a minute, which I think is so meaningful, leave it to me now, right, is the badger. And I'll explain it to you why it was so important, why that story means so much, and why when people read, I guess, there's no way to read my Hellblazer and know all of these things were part of my life until I put the addendum in the back of the collected omnibus, and then you're like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah, and honestly, that was one of the things after reading all the stuff you sent me about the back matter, I always had I really liked your run, and I was like, this is a great run, but I'm missing something, some piece of information that I just obviously I couldn't know, and that was that you are you are that information, that it's your life and what you grew up in and everything. So
And Matt, this might be my connection to Alan, right? Alan is a magician in a way, right? It depends on how you look at magic. And so, I lived this stuff. I didn't imagine it, and this was how I grew up. This is what I lived in, Imagine having a mum that sort of disappears for a few days and comes back, you're like 7, and you're like, well, my brother used to get mad and go over his mate Tim Fode's house, and I'd be there by myself, and it was terrifying, in the dark. And we had a lot of gypsy travelers, usually Romanian, like Romani gypsies, and they would come over to pick hops on the farm. And so they would get drunk, and mum would go like, if Jed comes, right, he's going to be drunk, so don't open the door. You're like, well, that's great. I'm 7.
Yeah.
And so you wouldn't. And here'd come Jed, like yelling and shit. But what you have to understand as well is that I think at 7 is when I met Tom, probably 7 or 8. And Tom was an old gypsy. He really liked me because he's sort of like, you're a country boy, but you're not one of us. Because I was a Romani gypsy, but we were what you might call didikoi. Like, might as well be gypsies the way we live, but not by heritage, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And so Tom he was a really good guy that he would like take me out snaring, for example. So he would take me out snaring rabbits, and there's a way that it happens, and it's not much fun, to be quite honest. You catch them in one particular way. They run to the field in one direction on what's called a rabbit run, and you can see which way they run to the field because the grass is tamped down in one direction only, because they do not come back along that rabbit run. They come back on a different path. So you can always know which direction they're going to travel and where. And so you put a snare on the other side of a route because they jump over a route, and then they get caught in the snare and it breaks their neck usually. But when it doesn't, you have to kill them. And when you're 7 or 8, the first time is no fun. You grab them by the back legs and smash their head against a tree, right? But that's how we got some meat. And we used to hang rabbits in our house all the time. My mum used to cook really good pastry. So she would cook pies, and the gypsies would steal meat off the farmer, bring them to our house, and she would cook up all the food, and then we'd have some and they'd have some. Or we'd have a lot of rabbit stew, which is really funny because my mum had a pet rabbit as well. So we would eat rabbits and have a pet rabbit.
Well, there's always the house animals and the farm animals, kind of, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing I thought was interesting, and I guess we got it wrong because we just kind of assumed that you came into this like, oh, I've read all the previous issues of Hellblazer before you started your run. I felt reading it that there was no disconnect like from your run compared to the other two, Jamie and Garth's run. And specifically, I thought like, oh, the ley line stuff that was in Jamie Delano run, like I'm like, oh, he must be totally just laying that down. Like, oh, I'm alluding to that, and that was just you grew up. Is that because you grew up in like similar? Well, I don't know where he grew up, but like just in general, you have this lore and stuff to come from that you guys understand because you grew up in the same country, or is it something else?
So, I'm not like I meet a lot of new agey type people who love ley lines and stuff like that, and they love to travel around in caravans and by choice. And I'm like, I would do it by choice. It's shit, right? But ley lines, depending on how you see them, when I was a kid, we could go to Stonehenge and lay on it, right? But then they cut it off, and then they put a motorway next to it, and that killed the magic in the place. It was gone. There's nothing there. Even if you go nowadays, it's nothing. There's nothing there. They look like stones. But I can take you down the road. I could take you to any other Avebury or any number of standing stones. If I drove you around the West Country, I'd take you to 70 places that have standing stones that just sit in a field. You know, I was just in Somerset. I was just on a hill calling a friend of mine in America, because now we got cell phones going. I'm sitting on top of like burial mounds of English kings. We used to lay on top of them because they're called fairy bumps, and you can listen to them. And at midnight, the fairies will start playing violins on them if you're stoned enough. And so, you know, every part of that, like we almost kind of understood the giants that had been the Romans, right? Because if you go on a tourist trip to Britain, you'll either go to Bath to see the Roman baths. You might go to the Tower of London and see the big wall that's out the back, because there's a piece of Roman wall. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that sounds fantastic. This is what we used to do. We used to walk out of our house, and if I turned left, I would go to school. But if I turned right, I'd find a Roman road that went over to Maiden Castle, which is the biggest Iron Age fort still in existence. And the road has a wall that is a Roman wall that goes for about 7 miles. And we used to pick up pieces of glass and all kinds of stuff that were Roman stuff constantly.
Wow.
So we lived in the shadow of the Romans, you know, and we were right next to a place called Binkham Bumps, and those were burial mounds. And I was just on top of some burial mounds with my brother. We used to go down the road to a place called Durdle Door. And, you know, when you hear this back, or if anybody's listening and they want to see it, find a picture of Durdle Door or Lulworth Cove. It's where they shot The Little Mermaid. It's a perfect cove. They're all pirate coves. And so this is that thing I'm saying, guys, you know, that like when you live in magic, and you don't have to see magic to understand magic. I think maybe, I don't know how Alan would say this, but I got my own thoughts, right? That magic is a state of mind, and magic is an environment, and magic is an atmosphere, and magic is a feeling. And so maybe I was just destined to be the guy that ended up being a writer that could kind of relay some of this magic in the first major job that I ever had, you know?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's interesting is Hellblazer himself is a magical DC character, right? But I feel like your run specifically brings the magic of the environment, the place he's in, out the most, at least for those first 3 runs. So
yeah, there's an anecdote that I do. I think I tell it in the back, because once I get to issue 97 of my run, which is the first time I could take a break, you know, I had the first arc was Critical Mass. The first story that I wanted to write was about Deanie, my friend who died. But the first story I had to write was the Australia one. So I'm now 9 issues in before I can write something that's more of a break for me, and something that I wanted to say. And there's actually some stuff that was hidden for years, right? If anybody understands DC right now, they're in an incredible place because they've got a lot of stuff going on with Scott Snyder, and they've done really good work, and they're selling 500,000 copies. But one of the things they just did was publish Swamp Thing number 88.
I got him. I love it.
Right. But they wouldn't publish it for a long time. And so I knew Rick Veitch, and I was pretty annoyed. You know, I knew Michael Zulli, I knew Rick Veitch, I knew Alan Moore, and they had canned the issue. And I thought it was incredibly hypocritical. No disrespect to DC now, obviously, but I thought it was very hypocritical that we could write about the devil without even blinking, but we couldn't write about Jesus Christ. And I was like, why? Right? Like, it's not sacrilegious to... So I took Tom, who I knew, and I put him in the role of Jesus. And it was the first appearance of Jesus in a DC comic book. And it was very subversive, because at a certain point he walks in and he says, I'm a shepherd. And Constantine says, well, don't you need sheep for that? And he's like, no, I can see my flock from anywhere. Yeah. So that was Jesus. And that was the first appearance. And it was intended to piss a bunch of people off.
Well, I don't know if I got that in that one issue, but when I think, you know, he comes back later at the end of the series of your run, and I was like, oh, it's God, or, you know,
Yeah.
Jesus. And so I'm like, oh, I totally did not get that it was that, or that he was that. So
No, we didn't pick that up at all.
Yeah, I can understand why, because you know, it's not like I'm overtly writing, hey, this is Jesus, and he got Jesus sign on his on
Yeah.
his halo.
There's a halo. And, you know.
But I can tell you this, that so as a kid, growing up the way that we did, you know, you could call me quirky, or you could call us insane, or you could call my mum insane, or you could whatever. But yeah, man, that's a different environment. And when we got to the farm, my dad had gone, and I think I was 5 years old. And a couple of years go by, and you're sort of like, wow, we can play with the farmers' kids, but we're not allowed to their birthday parties, for example. There's a class divide that just exists in Britain, and it still does, and it always will. But we didn't mind, it was part of it. We would look out the window as they would hold their firework displays for the kids, and they would have these rich parties that we would just wish we could go to, but we weren't allowed to because my mum was a house cleaner, right? And I will tell you that, because of a sort of an air of deprivation, there's not a lot of money, there's not a lot of food, there's not, like we pick in a lot of the food that we eat. To this day, you ask my brother if he wants a strawberry, he'll punch you because we ate so many strawberries because we would go steal them, right? Because we needed something to eat. And we could walk out of our house and pick an apple, and they're beautiful. Like British apples taste very nice compared to some of the American ones, and so you could walk out. But I think I was 7 and my brother was 10 when we started making wine and started making fucking hooch. Right? we would make elderberry wine, we'd make apple wine, we'd make cider, and it was so powerful that the adults would drink it, and they would just get absolutely crowned. And we were little kids making wine.
And very popular.
Look, do you know how you make really good cider? You actually make it with apples that have fallen off. The ones that are rotting in the sun are already fermenting. So there's all this stuff that we did that was very much in the country, but then there was this part of me that was isolated as a human, because I was scared. My dad was gone. My mom was mental. My brother was mental. And I was by myself, and I sleep in a fucking attic, right? And so there's parts of it that you have to fix yourself. And what I learned when I was a little kid was that I was afraid of the dark, and I was afraid of all of the things that were there because I knew they were there. I could feel them and sense them. And so as a little kid, I made a decision. I kid you not, there are some things that I did that I'm not so sure that other kids would do. And one of them was that I would walk in forests at night. Even though I was afraid of them. I would go to the places I was scared of, and I would walk through them to conquer my own fear. I was that insightful at 7 years old or 8 years old, I think. When I was 9 years old, my family were very fractured. My brother was kind of a bit of a bully to me when I was a little kid because he was trying to work out, like, why are my mum and dad not married anymore and why are we living this crap? He had seen more of their marriage than I had, so to me it was whatever. To him, it was like, I wish my parents weren't divorced. And so he would go off, my mum would go off, I'd be by myself. And there's this true story. I'd put it in a couple of stories. I remember I walked up to a barley field by an oast house, which is where they process the hops, they store them. And it's very pungent. And there was a hazelnut tree up there and a cherry tree, and there's a barley field. And when you see wind on barley, it really does ripple. And I lay in the barley field and I lay on my back, and I literally told myself, I think I was 9, I went, I'm not going to be them. I'm going to be different from my family. And so I started being different. I started learning everything. I started playing every sport I could. And when I was 11, as I said, we were about to go the wrong direction. And one of my teachers suggested to my mum that I take a common entrance exam to a private school, what we call a public school. So, where Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and all these people will get educated, as one of those schools. And they had like four scholarships, and I won one. So I moved away from home when I was 11 and I never went back.
That's very interesting.
So much of your family and your friends are in these issues in your run, just like they become such a big part of John's circle, and now we know how big of a part of your circle they were. Mm-hmm. Was there ever a time when you thought of a story that, like, oh, what if I do this, but it would have actually, you had the birth of your niece, Cider got possessed by a demon. Was there ever anything you were like, oh, I can't do that because a real person might be offended by something that happens?
Nah, they probably, all my mates are going like, that's cool. I was possessed by a demon. Oh, I got murdered. Really. After a while, I would say to friends of mine that I play football with, I'd always go like, do you want to be in a comic? or they'd say, "Can I be in one of your comics?" I'd be, "Yeah, as long as I can kill you." And so a lot of my friends have had really horrible deaths at the hands of like horrible creatures. No, I think maybe the only time I pushed it a little bit, but it was all true, was with Straff. Because Straff was a big guy, right? He's 6'7". You're talking the early 80s. There's a lot of band bomb marches. There's loads of like concerts. I remember Straff going to me one day, "Hey, do you want to go to a concert? It's Queen at Wembley." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay." We ended up like maybe 5 rows back. And if you actually watch that show, Queen Live at Wembley, which is this really famous recording, I'm there on Straff's shoulders, like yelling and getting drunk, right?
Oh my God.
So we did everything, right? We would do everything. All of me and my mates, we would just go, "Let's go do this today." And we would do it, right? We'd go and watch bands at universities. We'd get on a train and bunk all the way up to like Carlisle, right? Carlisle is literally at Hadrian's Wall. I thought it was North England. I had no idea how far north it was. Like we would go to Northampton before I ever met Alan, and like remember camping on the middle of a roundabout one time with them. You know, we didn't care, right? We did stupid stuff all the time. And but Straff, you know, I don't mind telling the story because I sort of told it in some ways. Straff had epilepsy, and his mum Betty had epilepsy, so we wrote her into the story, right? You know,
Yeah.
that she and Straff was this massive guy, and we were living in the projects at the time. Now I'm living in Romford in North London, which is the worst town in England. It's awful, and I'm not a town guy. And now I'm living in a flat with my mum, and Straff lives around the corner. And Straff, his mum would have epileptic seizures on the toilet. So Betty would basically be taking a shit, and then she'd do the crossword on it, and then she'd have an epileptic seizure, and now she's stuck in the toilet. And Straff could never get through the window, and his brother Bill could never get through the window because they were massive. So he'd come screaming at me, hey, she's done it again. And they'd stuff me through this window where I'm trying not to look at Betty sitting on the toilet, doing her crossword, having an epileptic seizure. So I literally wrote this into the story. If you recall, like John literally gets stuffed in, and then I'd open the door and they would take Betty to bed. But the reason I mention it is because Straff had always had epilepsy, but he didn't know. I don't think he knew or accepted the fact that he had the same epilepsy as his mum. And I'd stay over his house all the time. And we would go out with Straff. On a Friday night in Romford, you're talking about West Ham United fans in the early 80s. You're talking about the pure height of football hooliganism, where if you walk down the wrong road, you'll get stabbed. And I had seen 1 or 2 people get killed outside the front of the John Ball Brewery in Romford, for example. And so it was a very violent and messed up time in the towns in England, because it was post-punk, so there wasn't really a movement. But the music was great. There was ska music, there was new romantics, there was like Duran Duran, there was like, you know, David Bowie was going strong. All this stuff was going on, right? Amazing music, crazy life. The politics was all upended. And Straff we would go and buy acid from a pub called the Ruskin Arms, where on one side there would be a bunch of Hell's Angels who sold the acid. But the acid didn't have strychnine in it, so you could take as much as you wanted, which is not a good thing. It's not. It's a bad idea. If it's got strychnine in, you're thinking, okay, I won't overdo it. But if it doesn't, you're like, oh, great, I don't feel stoned yet. Rookie mistake, take more. And then you're just flying for a week, you know. And we went out one night. I wish I'd written this as a story. I really wish I'd written this as a story. It literally happened. We went out with Straff one night, and my mate Perry and Dave Coombs, who was like Lofty in the book, the little guy. Mm-hmm. We all go out, we buy this acid, we're wrecked out of our minds, and Straff has an epileptic seizure. And he's ill, and we're out of our minds, and we're like, but everybody was afraid of Betty, like a 78-year-old lady who moved about 1 mile an hour, right? But we were terrified of her. So in our minds, we were like, well, let's get Straff in his house. So we bundle him in his window. And now everybody's like, we got to protect Straff, which is a stupid idea because we might as well just let him sleep, right? So Perry Peel, he had this massive wardrobe. I don't know why he had it, but it was massive. It was taller than him. And so we laid it on the floor and it had fur coats in it. And we put him in the wardrobe to sleep. We took the mattress off of his bed. All of his porn was under his mattress. So everybody's like, great, we got porn. Put the mattress on top of on top, because there's no room in his room. Put the mattress on top of it. So I slept on the mattress, and someone else did. And then Coombsy slept on the bed frame, and someone slept on the floor. Everybody read porn until they were tired, and then went to bed, right? And I kid you not, it's such a great story. Probably 4 o'clock in the morning, all of a sudden you hear this banging. Let me out! I'm not dead. I'm not dead. Straff literally thought that we had buried him alive and that the fur coats from his funeral.
Terrifying.
And for the
gosh.
brief 10 seconds, he was convinced he'd been buried alive. Because he was high on acid, for one thing. So I often
fear
think,
initiated or unlocked. Yeah.
I often, yeah, right. And I often feel like, because my life was so much more interesting than fiction, that these stories kind of wrote themselves. You know, they were easy to write because half the time I would just call my brother and say, "What are you doing?" And he'd tell me some stupid idea he had, and I'm like, "Fantastic! I'm putting that in the book."
Yeah.
Actually, now it's funny. You mentioned Betty and Straff, and one of the issues I think we did get wrong was when she passed and your niece was born at the same time.
Yeah.
And I don't think Matt did, but I totally felt there was some sort of like a sinister feel to it. Not in any way that you did it, because obviously now we realize it's so much more of a poignant issue, but my head being sort of warped from previous Hellblazer stories and thinking the worst of every situation. Now we know at least that was it wasn't intended to be malicious, was it?
No. And there's actually, so I'm about to change the mood, but we'll change it for like 3 minutes and then we'll go back to the fun we're having. But I've got a story to tell you that is something that I've told a couple of times. I told it recently at Pinewood Studios when I did a speech there to talk about the power of creativity and what it is. And I believe as creative people, especially when we do comics, actually, we're very privileged to have an audience that reads our work and thinks they know us, you know. And in whatever form people know me through, say, the Sentry. You know, I recently did a series of the Sentry that was about losing an animal. And I think anyone that read it just bawled their eyes out because it was really sad. And we've all lost animals, right? It's very, very sad. And so I had this situation with that issue that I've spoken about a couple of times, but it taught me something about how I choose to deal with fans and how I feel that my interactions with fans are like a responsibility that I have and a privilege that I have. They're not a drag. Some creators don't like it publicly. They don't like to be at shows. They don't like the fans or something. I don't know, right? I can't speak for them. But I was at a show signing for Marvel years after I did Hellblazer. And there was a guy who was waiting outside the ropes. And I've always kind of known that when somebody's a bit shy, you may be the biggest thing in their year, right? Like you're their favorite writer and they want to meet you and they're scared or something. And so this guy stood outside the ropes and just holding one comic book and staring at me for an hour. And the line gets to the end where someone says, "I'm the last person in line." And he's still staring, and I kind of could tell. And I was like, "Hey, man, you all right? You know, you want a signature?" And he sort of looks behind him like, "What, me?" You know, and I'm like, "Yeah, man, come on." And I said, "Just come inside the rope. It's good." And he walked in, and you always know when someone is nervous because they'll hold the book in both hands. And he walks up trembling. He's literally physically trembling. And so I said, "Well, you know, do you want me to sign it to you?" And he just goes, "No." I said, "Okay." And I signed it for him and he grabbed it and walked away without saying thank you. And I thought, well, it's all right. He probably sort of shy or something. So I got an email about a week later from him. And he said, "Mr. Jenkins, I don't know if you remember who I am." And then he reminded me who he was. So go back in the past. When that issue came out, a month or two later, I got a piece of mail from the editor at, at DC. I think it was Axel Alonso, and it just said "Wow" on the envelope. And I opened it, and it was a letter from that guy. So you have to kind of put it together. Years before I met him to do a signing, he had sent me a letter. And what the deal was that he struggled with depression, and he was suicidal because he had lost his dad. So it's the story of Betty. He lost his dad, but in the same week, his brother and his sister-in-law had a baby, and he had a momentary pang of happiness at seeing the baby. And because he couldn't reconcile his feeling of happiness with his depression and his loss of his dad, he felt guilty about feeling happy, and so he chose to take his own life. And this is the 90s, and so there wasn't an internet to be able to work out how to do it. So he hooked up a car and he put it in and it turns out that he did it on a Wednesday. And he's like, well, if it's Wednesday, it's New Comics Day. I guess I'll put all the exhaust fumes in my car and I'll go and I'll read some comics. So he goes down to the comic store, buys a bunch of comics because it's New Wednesday, and he liked Hellblazer. So he starts the engine, and this is what he wrote to me, and he's reading Hellblazer, and he reads that issue where the same thing happens in someone else's family, just by coincidence. I want to be clear, I didn't save his life, but coincidence saved him, and he realized maybe there's I remember in his email or whatever, he said he didn't think it was a sign. He was like, oh, I think people go through this, and I could kind of see it a little bit. And he turned the engine off. So imagine being the writer of that book and meeting that guy and then hearing that story. Wow. It goes to show that you don't realize how often you're connected to people. But it taught me a lesson of maybe sometimes I'm somebody's friend, because they read my work all the time and they know me and they hear the words I'm saying. And in that guy's case, it was enough to help him get past it. And then he had the courage to come and see me. He was terrified to tell me the story. So he didn't tell me the story, but he had me sign his book.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful, and honestly, it makes me feel so much worse for thinking the worst about that story.
No. It's just
That's
it
just
goes
my
to
own
show.
warped.
It goes to show something, Hoku, right? It shows me that if I wrote the saddest poem about the cat that I lost, and I wrote it and I put it out in the world, and you read it and you came up to me at a show and said, I read your poem about your grandfather and that's the funniest thing I've ever read. It made me laugh. I'd be like, listen, that's fine. That's just as good. I moved your emotions, but I set a bomb that goes off when you read it and you get sad if I get it right. Like the Sentry story did that for everybody, right? Because he loses his dog. Spoiler alert. But the intent of the story isn't necessarily what people see, and that's okay, because they might see something else, and that's okay. It doesn't matter, because we're entertaining people, and your reaction may vary.
Yeah, I think one thing that both me and Hoku came at your run, which is I think a lot more honest and sentimental than the previous runs had been, or at least with the character.
Very.
We had a coloring from past misdeeds from John that kind of put a lens on your writing. And I was wondering, did you ever think about that while writing it, or do you notice that people take certain things in your run differently than you intended because they it's a sinister thing, or maybe, this isn't something we thought was darker than it ended up, or than it was intended to be?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. I'm glad. I think the way that I did the First of the Fallen as a Greek fisherman was cool. It was the first time that I did this thing that I was like, that's just instinct. I had been to Greece. I used to go to Greece with my mate Matt every year when we were teenagers, and we'd just bunk around the islands, meeting Scandinavian women. We had the time of our lives. It was fantastic. And we would get invited because of the kind of way that I meet people. I really love to meet people and know who they are. So we would meet all the fishermen and all that, and they would love us, and then they would invite us to Greek weddings, and we smash plates and stuff. And so the idea that he was a Greek fisherman was pure instinct, but it works really in hindsight. I'm like, actually, that's kind of cool. He's just trying to just play his trade, but he hates everybody on the boat. No surprise, right? But I think you can, in the end, you can see that people see things very differently from the way you intended. And they might see a character as sinister. They might, because preconceived notion is that John's a bastard, right? But I didn't really write him as a bastard. I wrote him. I didn't. I wrote him as a punk. I wrote him as a person that had a social conscience, that railed against mistreatment of people who are truly the heirs to the true people of Britain. If you look at the royal family, it's a bunch of Germans and Greeks, man. None of those. They are sit on the throne because somebody from Greece married someone from Germany in an arranged marriage of convenience, right? Do you really think they're descended from the people of England? Not a chance. And the people of England aren't even descended from the people of England because there's such a connection to the Vikings. There's such a connection. England and Wales didn't exist as England and Wales. They're just part of a region, right? Southern Wales is still just across the Severn Estuary from England, right? So it's pretty much the same. You're not dividing it. But once you get to the mountains, it's divided, right? The Romans wouldn't go into Wales because they were like, why bother? We won't go in. The Welsh won't come out. We'll just leave it there, So I think when you write all of that stuff, you're simply relaying all the things that, like I told you before, magic and the things that I knew about and the world that we lived in and the stones that we saw and the Roman roads that we walked down and the green lanes especially. Like, I can ride on a train in England and I can point out where the green lanes are. I know exactly what those green lanes say. Sometimes they live right by the railway tracks. And so I do think that my job was to try to relay that the magic of England is something that is worth thinking about because we throw it away we don't look out the window. We just sit on a train and our eyes go forward and we play on our phone. And I'm like, man, you miss all of it. It could all go past you and you're missing everything that's there. And even back in the 90s when I wrote it, I felt that that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You put so much of yourself into like every issue of this run. Have you ever not done that? Have you ever written anything that was purely just to write it to meet a deadline or anything, or is there always a part of you in your writing?
Maybe if you read the way that I put together the omnibus, maybe the last 8 issues, because at that point, Sean was gone. I had written issue 120, which is a funky issue. And again, I'm not sure you guys quite got that right. I'll explain mine a bit. But I was now on 121 and Sean was gone and I should have gone with him. Because Axel said, I want you to write him in America. And I'm like, why?
Yeah.
And so the last 8 issues that I wrote did do some interesting things. They bring it full circle and Rich tells him to get lost. Rich is like, I can't be around you. You're too dangerous. I've got a family. Which is quite sad to write, I didn't want to write that really, but I was sort of like, I got to get out of here. I got to get out of writing Hellblazer. I don't want to be here anymore. It shows in the last 8 issues. Not that they were bad, but that I couldn't, if you read my notes on it, I'm sort of like, I don't even know what I wrote, really. I wrote about America a bit, but it wasn't really me,
Yeah, I think when we were going through it, we were like, there's something about this feels different than what you had previously written. And I wasn't, like, something about the way that the story flowed.
Yeah.
I was like, something feels off. And I thought maybe it was just because, you got a different artist, and sometimes an artist like Sean Phillips is amazing. So him, the way he tells stories through his panels, maybe that was what it was, I thought. But yeah, it makes sense when I read what you said, like, oh, I was just told, like, put him in America, and I had to kind of come up with this. And what about was Ellie being like the big bad kind of ending? Was that supposed to be part of the run, or is that
that was intended? I was going to get to this point, right? There were a few things that I railed against, and it's just as a person, as a human, I guess, there's sort of some things that I find. So one of the things I learned early on, my mum, being as odd and weird and as eccentric and crazy as she is, was also very much an original card carrying, bra burning women's liver, right? You're talking about a time where you, and so you're sort of raised in a pretty straightforward feminist environment that isn't like feminist. I'm gonna fight for a cause. It's men and women are not at all different except the way they get paid. Look at the stupidity of that, right? So in a sense, it was very educational and it was very useful to my life to be able to judge people as people and not men and women as different, for example, right? Not to virtue signal myself, but more to say like that's just how I was raised, right? And so I could see in comics the sexualization of women in a way that I began to just, I have a particular way that I crusade for things, which is to write good stories. I'm not anybody's crusader. I'm not a feminist crusader. I'm not a racial relations crusader. I just try to write good stories that mean something to human beings. And the sexualization of women was exhausting. It was like boring. I just think it's a shitty story, right? Every superhero and every super heroine is this sexualized kind of power fantasy thing. So I like doing superhero comics because I've got something to say. But look at what the Sentry is about losing a dog is very different from like look at the tits on Power Girl, right? It's exhausting. and I just so Ellie had been this sexualized creature. I want him to have a relationship, and I want him to be and I'm like, she's a succubus, man. She's supposed to be evil. They don't just succubi like suck out of your soul. At least that's what I was taught when I was a little kid, right? They're evil. And so I was like, well, she looks good, but she's not good then, right? She's not going to. And so I wanted to do something about stories that I thought might really piss people off, to be quite honest, because the people it was going to piss off were people who sexualized Ellie or sexualized John's romantic liaison, Danny, without thinking about it for a minute, right? Like, she could be our own person. So we did a whole thing in which, and this was something that I think you guys were sort of talking about, but there was a specific point. She has an ex-boyfriend that kind of comes back and messes with her.
Yeah.
Right? And I think you liked that cover, didn't you?
Oh yes, yeah, that was a great.
Oh, there it is! Oh my god,
it's amazing.
Yes.
So I didn't want to write some dude's version of feminist literature. I just don't need to. There's plenty of other people talking about it. But I did think that it was interesting, that most of the time when some dude is worried about whether or not he's getting possession of somebody, usually the object of his affection, unrequited love, it's not because he sees that person as an equal, but he wants to own or control that person, which is just pathetic, right? And I'm like, great. Who's the strongest then in that relation, Danny or her ex-boyfriend that acted out and punched her? So it wasn't that we just gave him a period, because you guys talked an awful lot about menstrual cycles when you were reviewing it, right? And I was like, no, what I think the magic was more, he was always afraid of her, which is why he acted out and physically punched her, because maybe he could physically dominate her. But what was he most afraid of? He was most afraid of the fact that she was probably more powerful and more pain resistant and smarter than he was. And so he got to become the thing that he was afraid of. Right. And that was a bit different from most of the menstrual cycle bits that you guys were talking about.
Well, I did posit that because he was having sort of like, he was feeling her pains. He was like feeling like he was transforming. I hoped by the end that he did become a woman and then stayed a woman, that was part of the magic. And that's what I imagined, because I was like, that would be the perfect,
The perfect payment. Okay.
punishment.
The thing
Yes.
that you have been afraid of
Yes.
and gone after is the thing that you become. Good luck
Yeah.
with that for the rest of your life. Yeah. So that was the
Yes.
implication of the story. And, that's certainly, I
Oh,
agree with you
good.
that,
That's what I was hoping.
yeah, that's what I sort of implied, but I don't necessarily always answer those kind of questions, but I thought it was worth it. And then going back to Ellie, the point was that I was a bit tired of watching people kind of go off about how pretty she was. And I'm like, yeah, okay, fantastic. She's also a succubus, come
Hmm.
on, right? Like you're more interested in the fact that she's pretty and maybe she and John can have sex. Like, wake up, man. Like, grow up for fuck's sake. And so I wrote a story in which he he does the succubus on her. He takes her down by doing to her what she does to everybody else. And she's furious. And she then plots her revenge and takes him down in many ways at the end. And it was a really long cycle of like this antagonistic relationship. I'm telling you, when that first issue came out, where he really takes her down, and he uses her like she has used many other people. He sees her as a demon, and he knows she's a demon. Right? He don't have some personal relationship with her, except this peripheral, cursory kind of relationship. And man, did I get that's the one issue I wrote that there were a lot of angry fans who hated it because she
All
wasn't.
dudes, I'm suspecting,
All
right?
dudes, all dudes, because in the last few pictures and the last few pictures in the book, she's not pretty. She's a demon.
Oh, I love that. When Matt was describing that, I was like, that is awesome. You finally get to see who she really is
Yep.
because, she shows this face to the world. She
Mhm.
shows this, super sexy version that she uses to, tempt and like destroy people. But to see her, like her real form, to see who she really is, I thought that was brilliant.
Thank you. So it's interesting. You look back at it and that's sort of like, oh yeah, I haven't thought about that for a long time. There was one issue, or I think it was a 2-issue story that was literally the only time I've ever had an idea that inspiration hit me, and I went, oh my god, and I wrote the story. And that's the one where he runs Widdershins around he runs the jogger. And it was because I played a lot of soccer and I was running one day and I was training and I used to go out of my house in Northampton, Massachusetts, and I would run around a graveyard. And I realized one day, oh shit, I've been running anti-clockwise around this graveyard for a year. And my mum had told me if you walk Widdershins, you actually walk 3 times around a graveyard anti-clockwise, the ghosts will come and haunt you. And I'm like, maybe that's why my life has gone to shit, and so I suddenly had this moment. I was like, oh man, what if this was real? What if some guy? So that was like one that just like, I think it's the only story of my career that I suddenly had this idea and went, I should write that, and just did it, because it sort of was an inspiration. There were some that were based on things like, that I knew about, like the Wild Hunt. There's one where he chases a wild hunt, but what he does is he puts his arms through the middle of a dead sheep and it's infected with werewolf blood. Yes, I am the guy who put his arm through the middle of a dead sheep. We, as Air Force cadet, we were up in the hills and we had drunk so heavily the night before we couldn't even stand, and some idiot pulls out a frisbee and starts throwing it around, and a gust of wind catches it, and I said I'll get it, and I jumped over, but I forgot I had a backpack on, like a big military backpack, and I caught my foot on a stone wall and I put my arms through the middle of a dead sheep. Right. It's really happened. And then I think if I look back at my own work, I have a big soft spot for 97 because it was about me walking through forests. It wasn't even the fact that I had Jesus in it, and it wasn't even the fact, but there's something else very special, and it's a piece of magic that I thought you guys would really dig that came from my life, right? And it's true magic, in my opinion. It's not the magic that people think of as like conjuring, and it's not the magic that comes from demons and all that. It's the magic of the British countryside. But the point of 97 was, for me, was that he walks into a forest in the middle of the night, and when you come out the other side, something about you will have changed. Now, I walk through forests even to this day, and everyone that knows me is like, he's gone for a walk, and I'll be out in the middle of a forest somewhere. in the pit. I like to do it in the dark, but I don't do it as much in America because there are bears, and I've run into a couple, and it's not
Yeah.
the smartest thing in the world. But I like to go on a walkway that is actually, that's out, and there's an interesting place near us that has a bit of energy in it that I think is pretty interesting. There's a thing there. I think it's not good and it's not bad, but it's certainly been there for a long time. And so I walk there at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I talk to it sometimes. Sometimes it so it says, you either. I feel like I'm a bit like Alan at this point, kind of telling some anecdote about some magical thing. But the thing that happened to me when Tom, the old gypsy, would take me out, he would teach me things like, why do birds fly higher in the summer? Because the currents of air take the bugs up higher. And so that's why you see them higher in the summer and lower in the winter, because the bugs get taken up on the air currents. Why, if you take the British shrub, it's a stinging nettle, and if you rub up against it, it just covers you with welts, right? But you can grab it and it doesn't sting you. Why? Because there are microscopic barbs of poison in it, and if you grab it, you crush them all. So as a little kid, I remember the rite of passage of him going, you got to grab that nettle. I'm like, I'm not touching it. And he's like, you got to do it, you got to do it. And then close my eyes and grabbing it and going, oh my God, it didn't hurt. Because they have all of that. The gypsies have all of that knowledge. And so one night, I think it was about 2 or 3 in the morning, and it was in the winter, and there was a full moon, and it had snowed. And it doesn't snow very often in Britain, but the ground was covered. And there was an apple orchard right outside, and Tom comes for me about 2 or 3 in the morning, and my mum has made hot chocolate for me, and he's got a flask on him, and he's like, come on, I'm going to take you to meet the boy. And you have to understand the importance of the badger to the gypsies. He's the king of the forest. He's the thing. He's the most important. He's more important than the fox. He's more important than the owl. The crows are important. Actually, even to this day, I still tip my hat at crows when I'm playing golf. I can't get out. You can take the boy out the country, but you can't take the country out the boy. And so he takes me out, and we sit outside, and I'm sitting on a stump, and he's sitting on a stump. And he's like, you got to be silent. And it was very much a rite of passage. Okay, can I be silent? I'm a little kid. I'm 7 years old. I've got chocolate. Can I be silent? How long can I be silent? And so I'm silent, and I'm waiting, and I'm listening, and it's cold, and I'm drinking hot chocolate, and he's unsipping his flask and drinking his whiskey and then waiting. And to me, it was about an hour went by. And all of a sudden you hear this snuffling in the hedgerow, and a badger comes out. And there is no human being alive that will have seen a European badger. Not really. You don't see them. They won't come anywhere near people. But they do come near the gypsies, and that is pure magic. They know who's looking out for them, because the gypsies watch out for what's called the badger's set, which is where the badger lives. Is the farmers always want to kill the badgers because they blame them for killing the chickens. And we all know that it's always the farmer's dog that does it. And so, you've got this kind of relationship between the farmers where they go on the hunts, and they'll chase the foxes down and cut their tails off and murder the foxes. And then you've got us who are like, no, fuck you, stand in the way. And anyway, so the badger comes out, and it snuffles around Tom's feet in the snow. And then he makes one gesture, and he's like, go on. And the badger walks right over to me and walks around my feet and rubs up against me. And that is magic, because that was him introducing me to the badger and the badger to me, to tell the badger that I was okay to be trusted, because they revere the badger, right? And so to me, I carry that magic with me always. And I'm like, if you ever want to think if there's magic, yes, it's an animal. Yes, it's some kind of relationship with the animals or whatever. But that's what I wrote in Hellblazer always, the magic of the English countryside. And so Tom was really important to me, because I didn't have a dad. And so he was my father figure. He kind of was my deified, like Jesus-like figure in a sense, this old boy who liked to teach me about the ways of the country. And I think, once you've had that magic in your life, that magic is real. And so my brother and I have known we We don't think that magic is real. And maybe that's where Alan has been coming from all these years. It's not that you think it's real, it's that you know it's real in a form. But how that form is real, sometimes it's because you tell a story and someone cries, and that's pretty magic, isn't it? Or you tell a story and someone laughs, and that's also magic. So I think the magic resides in the person, and that we can bring magic to other people because of the way that our universe works. And then when you stack that up against people sitting on their phones or fighting about politics, especially right now, getting on the internet or being bored or yelling at each other or like being part of a cult or yelling about, this or that, or thinking that their chosen politician is right when us punks were like, none of them are right. They're all stealing your money. So you chill out, right?
Yeah.
That's what our job is as creators, is to bring magic and to set little magic traps for people and then make them smile in the comfort of their own home or wherever they're reading the book. And so you can, if you believe that and you know that that's true, you can actually get some form of accomplishment, because now you're beginning to understand how to move people's emotions. And that's what I hope that we did with Hellblazer.
I think your run for sure. I mean, you put so much more into it that we weren't expecting. We thought this was just going to be another run of stories, some weird stuff that John would do, but to find out the personal things that you put in here, the people, the incidents, and I got to say your back matter was just beautiful for sharing all of that with us, all these stories. We were so happy.
It was interesting that my editor Alex said, "Man, I got the weirdest thing to tell you. I heard from the legal team today." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, we're putting out the omnibus." And he's like, "Yeah, man." He said they called me and they were like, "Man, this stuff is awesome. We love this thing." He's like, "The legal team." So he's supposed to make sure that we've got all the things, but I think that they understood, that they were reviewing it and they were like, "Man, I'm caught up in this guy's story," right? With Rich, who we've glossed over, and I think that's important as well. Like Rich, my brother, right? My brother, like me, knows where the magic is, and he goes there all the time. He lives in it. He lives in basically a scrap heap. He has no electricity to this day. I went to go see him in March to go see my mum on the way back from Helsinki. And I stayed in Britain for a few days. And the first night picks me up in a car. And we always know it's a lottery, right? Like that car will either get us from Heathrow Airport to where he lives or it won't. And it's 50-50. And it got us there. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, we wind up on the scrap heap, on the land, basically. But you have to understand that land has a tree that's 2,000 years old on it. He knows exactly where it is. He knows every flower that's on there. It has roundhouses from the Bronze Age,
Wow.
All of that is in that land. And so when I go out on that land and walk out of the land and go walking, I can do it with my brother, right? I can go walking and I can feel that land. That land, you can be on that land and say 1 o'clock on a Sunday and you can hear the church bells ringing down, but that church is built in 960. It's not a church. It's not your average Baptist church. It was built in 960 and half of the floor is made up of old gravestones that can't be read anymore. They just repurposed them, right? Huh. The Romans had a bakery down there. So just across on the other person's land, right next to my brother's, they're excavating the Roman bakery. And when I talk about magic and kind of this contradiction between punk rock, which is what we grew up with, and magic, here's an anecdote. You know in the story that my John is a punk and he's Rich has got a band called Fatal Gift. It's a true band. My brother, when I came here as a musician, he's like, "I'm going to be in a band too," but he's fucking tone deaf, so he couldn't play anything. So he plays in this punk band. And at one point, I was over in Britain seeing my brother, and it's the most beautiful juxtaposition you've ever seen. In the corner, the band's playing and they're making the loudest noise. And in the corner of the barn that they were in, there were a bunch of archaeologists because the band had been playing and someone had kicked a piece of tile, and it turns out it was a Roman mosaic, and it had been lost for centuries. And so they told everybody, hey, there's a mosaic in here. So the archaeologists were dusting this mosaic while the loudest, worst punk music in the world is being played, because the band's like, yeah, we're still going to play, right? My brother ended up in a band called the Chainsaw Tree Pirates, and they played at Glastonbury. They stuck chainsaws on their guitars and they would play. They'd start the chainsaws up, and as they were playing, they would carve stuff out of wood, and my brother would set light to his drum kit. He played the drums because he was so tone deaf that that's all he could do. But when you look at just the pure like hilarity of that, sometime my brother called me, and he was really a pioneer of wanting phones. He liked phones. And that, you know, they had these OnTAC things in the mid-90s that actually were phones that were, and he would cobble one up and he would have one. And I remember him calling me one time, and he's on top of a van, and they've put boots on it, and he's got some skis on it or something. He's trying to, he liked Eddie the Eagle Edwards, who was the British ski jumper. And he said, I'm going to be the world's first punk ski jumper. And he's like trying to balance on top of this van, talking to me on the phone. And all of a sudden he's like, oh shit. And it goes silent. And the van has thrown him over a hedge, and he's landed backwards in a hedge, right? He called me one time, and he went, you never guess where I am. And I went, you're on top of Stonehenge. And he went, you bastard. Because I knew, because we live in the solstice, right? We live with Samhain, and we live with the solstice, and that's how we grow up. Understand that my education in the country is a mix of Christianity and paganism. The Harvest Festival is a Christian festival, but everybody nods and winks because we all know it's a festival of the harvest, right? It's a pagan festival. So he calls me and he goes, you never guess where I'm at. And I'm going, you're on Stonehenge. And he went, oh, you bastard. And then he went, hang on a minute. And you can hear a noise in the background. And I'm like, what happened? And he goes, oh, I just kicked a copper in the head. And this was the year that they climbed up on Stonehenge, and my brother ends up on the front of every national newspaper standing on top of Stonehenge because they wanted to report that the punks had taken over Stonehenge and what hooligans they were. But if you look in the back, and I think it's my favorite photo in the back, there's a moment where my brother is standing up and he's got his arms out, and his shadow is being cast onto the altar stone of Stonehenge because he is the King of England.
That's awesome.
That belongs to us. That Stonehenge doesn't belong to the people that put a parking lot next to it, and it doesn't belong to the government. It doesn't belong. It would be okay if it was just a national trust, but these people like turned it into a tourist thing for what? For their profit. And we're like, it doesn't belong to you. When I was a kid, I could go stand on it. Now you're telling me I can't go anywhere near it? Fuck you. It doesn't belong to anyone to tell us that's ours. And so if obviously one of my favorite parts of this entire run was when I did Rich the Punk Psychic Sleuth. And there's a whole issue about the misadventures of Rich the Punk, like running into William Shakespeare in a pub or meeting Jack in the Green. And that issue was so special to me because it was like, these are the people that really are the kings and queens of England.
Yeah, well, one thing I liked, I mean, Rich the Punk is one of my favorite characters, and just knowing that he is a real person is mind-blowing to me. I can't even imagine. And that was one thing, like, all the characters in your run, because they're real people, I almost can't believe that they're real people. They're so interesting and eccentric, and, you know, like, just characters that I've never met people like that. Or if it has, it's like one person a long time ago in college or something that I still mention, you know, like I don't have a group of friends where I'm like, I got this guy, he's on top of Stonehenge, or he's, you know, like my brother has not done anything like that. But that's why, like, I would never have even thought that these were real people. You know, I just thought, oh, wow, he's got a really inventive imagination for characters. when you come up with this new friend group for John.
Yeah.
Or that maybe you pulled some, some little bits from this person here or this person there, not that you actually realized real people as real characters. It was
Yeah.
brilliant.
Especially Rich, because I used to like writing Rich for Punk because I could just call my brother and go, "What are you up to?" And he'd go like, "Oh, like." He'd have these. My brother is mental, just like my mum, and he'd have these ideas. He had this idea one time. He called me up and he was like, "You know what we're going to do in Y2K? Is just before it hit. You know what we're going to do? I'm going to organize a worldwide rave, and at midnight, everybody's going to jump up in the air and then land. Right? This is Rich's latest idea because he's out of his mind on something, calling me up with his plan for world domination. And he's like, yeah, so everyone will jump up at midnight and the whole world will shake. And I said, Rich, it's midnight in different countries at different times. And he went, oh, you fucking bastard. And he put the phone down. So it's a laugh a minute being a member of my family, my 3-person family, me, my mum, and my brother. Because there is stuff. I mean, Richard told me that he had been to the Ram Inn, which is this famous haunted ancient inn, and he said that the owner, who he said it was like an episode of Scooby Doo, the owner was like, hello, and he's mental, and they were like, I'm going to meet this old man Peterson, right? And the guy went to him, do you want to see a ghost? And Richard said, yeah, okay, because I think that's an interesting thing too. People think either they believe in ghosts or they don't. And for Richard and I, in many instances, I don't have to believe in ghosts because I've experienced them. And it's been more than one time. So some people go, well, that guy's mental, and that's the end of this conversation, right? He clearly thinks ghosts are real and I don't, right? And that's fine, but I do think that we are tapped into the universe like the dream time. And I think that we can see other things. So the guy takes Richard downstairs and there's a basement to it and like a sub basement. And he said, are you ready? And Richard said, yeah. And he said, okay. And he basically shut the door and Richard said a little light started jumping up and down. He's like, I can do this 100% of the time if you want. So I think there's more things in heaven and earth than the dreamt of in our philosophy, as they say. And maybe that's another part of what I was writing about,
Yeah. Yeah, the closest thing I can think of, because one thing about America is it's not as well. At least the colonization part of it is we don't have the history like you're talking about. Oh, in 900 AD this wall was here or whatever. So, like the closest that we can get is these national forests, and that's I can kind of relate to what you're talking about with the outdoors and kind of the magic in that. I go camping a lot in national parks and forests and stuff. So that's like the closest I have to relate to those kinds of things. So it was kind of fascinating, like hearing you talk now, and then also just in your back matter that it was it's kind of like this culture that I'd never heard of, almost like, with the Dreamtime and the Aboriginal peoples, it's like, I'd never heard of this magic culture or this magic in their culture before. And honestly, your run was like the first time I'd ever read anything about that, and it was very interesting. And then the same thing with this British kind of mythology and lore of the true people of it, of the land. It's very interesting and just fascinating, and I thank you for kind of exposing me and everybody else to it that listens to the podcast.
I think in the end, you look back at your own work and you don't know how to assess it, and then maybe many years go by and you're like, okay, well now I can look at it and see what do I think I got right, what do I think I got wrong. Like I said, the last 8 issues, I'm like maybe not. There's stories. I think you've probably seen the back matter. There's a story set in London with the two old people. And that's and they live in a house next to a ghost. And the ghost is like this tragic ghost who loves the girl who lives there because, And I think that was the first time I wrote a line that affected me personally. I've been writing. So this is a true story. Strauss' granddad was too young for the first war, too old for the second and fought in both. And he was caught at Dunkirk, and he was made to walk in and out with the tide to keep his rifle dry. And he almost fell asleep in the water and almost died. And they fished him out right at the last second. And he had a piece of his hand shot off or something. But I had written a line that said he was thinking of his girl and he could smell her perfume. And this is me as a young writer trying to, work out what I'm writing. And I wrote a line that said, and she walked in and out with him, helping him keep his rifle dry. And I started crying like 2 o'clock in the morning. Because I knew I knew Strath's granddad, and I knew my nan. I loved her so much, and she and my granddad were like the center of the universe in our family because they had a house, and and they lived in London. And so, writing that line and realizing that I carry my grandmother with me everywhere I go, and I can smell lilac and go, oh my God, that's like my nan. It makes me think of the duck pond, and this was the experience. And then there's a line in it that says, like, basically something about like all the Jacks are dancing with their girls,
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, man, it's like talking to my mum. She was a little girl and she remembers the American GIs and she remembers making friends with them. And then one day they were all gone. And the next morning she woke up very early to go to school and they saw the gliders going over silently. They were going to D-Day. And so you write about this whole experience, of the English countryside, and even our relationship with America, and even our relationship with American GIs, and our relationship with wartime. I wrote the Civil War, the First War, the Second War. All of that is in our country, and all of that lives inside, but it doesn't live in London, where John Constantine had been hanging around, smoking in pubs and hating Catholicism. And it doesn't live in politics, which is a false world as far as we're concerned. It lives actually inside the country, which is really where I was coming from.
Yeah, I think that really shows through. And I think that's what sets your run apart, while still feeling like it's like that is John and that like we know this character. You did a very good job of kind of bringing that magic to the character that no one realized it had been missing until you brought it there. So,
possibly, yeah. And as a young writer, I was just like trying to work out and I realized what I could say. I just wanted to tell everybody about the world I knew,
Yeah.
It's so funny because, okay, so, your Straff's granddad. I mean, so many of these characters are real, but I think the two we were wondering the most about was Slobodan a real person and was
Yeah.
Danny a real person?
Danny was
'Cause they
not.
both-
Danny was made up
No.
from. Danny was made up from every American girlfriend I had. She sort of was, she was just a girl.
I loved her.
Yeah, I liked her too because she was sort of like American. I had found, American women were more likely to do things like play soccer. They would go out and do sports and play soccer, and I was like, I like that, right? That's really cool. It's kind of, I like being in America, and obviously if you got a British accent, you're doing okay.
Oh yeah, I mean,
License to print money in America.
pretty much.
So and I did Ninja Turtles for a living, so I had a lot of girlfriends, but Slob was a guy that I'd known, but only briefly, but he was more of a tragic character than it seems in the story. He'd seen some shit out there that was probably, and he had probably done some stuff out there that wasn't that much fun either,
Yeah, I think that came
and this
across.
is even pre Balkans War. There was a lot of gangsters. There was a lot of killing. There was a lot of racial tension. There was a lot going on there. So I knew that guy Slob briefly. One that we did know was Muppet.
Okay.
Muppet was a biker that we hung out with, and we would always be in fights on a Friday night down the chip shop. We get in like punch-ups because the West Ham's hooliganism was crazy, but we would go out drinking anyway, and so we weren't wearing West Ham scarves, so we were fair game, and so there would just be constant fist fights. The amount of fist fights that I've been in my life where I don't really want to be in a fist fight, but I'm in one anyway. And the funniest part was always, and I wrote it in Hellblazer, that Straff, who was 6'7", would always run away.
It's funny how that
Natural
happens.
pacifist.
Yeah, he was a natural pacifist and then you'd say, "Where were you, mate?" And he'd be like, "Oh yeah, I chased 6 of them away by myself." And he'd be like, "Didn't look like it." Meantime, my friend Perry's covered in blood, and I've got a shiner, and we survived another night in Romford on a Friday, and Straff's like, "Yeah, I chased them all away." Thanks, Straff. So I mean, now you guys get a sense of like. You could see the back matter, and I think now maybe what you see is that there wasn't as much coordination as a publishing entity and an intent that you guys inferred into there. Maybe, you were saying, well, I think DC and Paul were doing this, and they were doing this, and it was like, no, they were just letting me tell stories in the way that I wanted to, up until 121, at which point then it was a story that they wanted. So I kind of ended my overall story with Rich and Ellie and everybody like rejecting John and him being alone again, having made the mistake that he always makes, gone around in a big circle, and then we're done. But if you look at my run on Spider-Man with Mark Buckingham, if you look at the way that I completed certain arcs and certain things that I've done, they usually bring them around to a place that.
Yeah, I one thing I liked about your run is that you didn't kill off all of his friends and everybody. They just were like, hey, we can't be around you anymore, so we're leaving. I liked that because I liked the characters so much. I didn't want to see anything bad happen to Rich and his family or any of the other friends.
Yeah, but he realizes he's the king of England and he has a responsibility now. Mm-hmm. To the heir of the king, the heir, which is Cider, and he has to perpetuate it and look after his family. And it's interesting, my brother, like typical punk, would yell and scream and say, screw the establishment and screw all of that. But in the end, the punks were really good parents and they were trying to raise their kid with some values because that's what punk was actually about. Believe it or not, it was like, we don't care. It's like, yes, we did very deeply care. And we wanted to make sure we weren't making the turn on, tune in, drop out mistakes of our parents from the 60s.
Mm.
So at the very end, one of the catalysts was that Muppet ended up in a car crash and he ended up in the hospital. He didn't die, did he? Because we didn't really.
What do you think?
I mean, we hoped he didn't. There was no funeral, so we kind of hoped that he recovered and he was okay.
Well, then he can have recovered and been okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, okay, good.
I just assumed because none of the other friends did. I was like, okay, Muppet's fine then. We'll just go with that.
Muppet's fine. He's dead. His real name was Martin.
Oh, really?
I'm sure he wouldn't like it if I said, even to this day, he's probably like, don't you dare tell him that.
Yeah. We're honored that you told us.
Yeah. No, it's been interesting to me. I was fascinated by how after the fact you guys would read through the story and have some sense that this and I would get some insights from things that you had thought of, and I was like, that's fascinating. That's a good idea. I didn't think of it that way, but I suppose you could see it that way. And like I said, other times, I'm not messing with you. Like there are other times when I think you were a long way off, but it's more interesting to me, when you were a long way off. Like I think one of the ones, I'm not sure if you quite got this. You understand the one about when he does Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Mm-hmm. And so the private school that I went to, the one I got, was actually the school that Samuel Taylor Coleridge went to. And so, I love the idea that he's writing Kubla Khan and it's a manifesto of heaven. And Constantine's the man from Porlock who comes and interrupts Samuel Taylor Coleridge because he's trying to stop the angels from spreading heavenly propaganda. Mm-hmm. It was a really good idea, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I loved the fact that I can't remember which one of you also thought that my favorite ending to a book was your favorite, because the last line of the book is he sort of says, well, what do you think of all the Samuel Taylor Coleridge and stuff? And he goes, I don't know, man, I was busy looking at her tits.
Yes.
He thought that was hilarious.
Yeah, I love that. I was like, that is the greatest ending.
It is, because you got all this highbrow kind of stuff about Coleridge and Heavenly
Yeah.
Manifestos and Riches. Like, I don't know, man. I was looking at tits.
Yeah. Yeah, that was fantastic. That's what, like, some of the stuff that endeared Rich to me, especially. I was like, I love these. Just he is himself unapologetically everywhere he goes. In any instance, he's just him. You know.
He is though. That's my brother, right? He's a tree surgeon. He spent years climbing trees. He's much older now. It's much harder for him to do it. I put this in Werewolf by Night when I wrote this, right? That they would have a dog. It was called Loopy, and the dog would chase falling trees, and it kept getting injured. So they would string it up in a hammock, and they would swing Loopy as they went past, and they would work on all the trees, and every so often they'd walk past the dog and swing the bloody thing. And the dog was so stupid, it would, like, they'd be driving down the road, it would see a tree and jump out the window at like 60 miles an hour, and they'd be like, it's surely dead. So these stories that you get from my brother, you know, like, this is literally the way that he and I lived. We didn't listen to everybody else's ideas. We went and lived them ourselves. And even to this day, I still do. I go and I do things that I want to know about. I want to try. I'm working right now, I kid you not, on a puppet show. And I made the puppets myself.
That's amazing.
And I put them in the basement, and then we recorded them, and now we've done a camera test, and now we're going to build the puppets out and start putting the puppet show out. Because I think that in our lives, when someone says you can't do it, it means that they can't do it. And I think that that is the one benefit of growing up as my mother's son, as my brother's brother, is this idea that I love it when people tell me that I can't do something. It means they can't do it. And I think that's very much what we got from the punk ethos. And I think that's very John Constantine. How did you guys think about the TV show when you saw it? Have you seen it?
I saw
I
it.
only saw like one episode, so I only got to see the introduction, and it was a while ago. I thought that, at least to me, the actor
Yeah, he was
felt
perfect. Yeah, he was
really
good.
well done
Yep.
as John. But I
Yep.
think, Matt, you actually finished the series.
Yeah, I finished the series. I actually watched it fairly recently because I realized I hadn't watched all of it, because I was watching it when it came out, and I was like, it feels kind of watered down. It's not quite what I was looking for. But I mean, the only other thing we had was, you know, the movie, and so compared to the movie,
But I think that the movie was more closer to John than the TV show. I thought the show was absolute crap. And the reason I thought it was crap is I turned on one episode and John needs to find something. And so he starts making magical incantations, and he starts swinging some smoke around, and it makes magic arrows that point towards where he's supposed to go. And I'm like, there's no way that John Constantine does that. John Constantine knows one thing, and Alan would say this, and anyone that knew the character would say it. He never uses magic because it costs you much more than you get from it. So the idea that John goes into a magical incantation as a direction finder made me immediately go, they have no sense of why this is interesting. You know?
yeah, I think that was kind of the newer, after the 300 issue run of Vertigo ended, they made him more of like, oh, I have fireballs and I'm putting out pentagram, you know, things or whatever. And that's not my John, honestly. So
No.
I haven't really read any of that stuff, but yeah, the movie was actually what got me into the character, because the stuff that I thought was very interesting when I saw it when I was like in high school, I was like, oh, that's a really cool take on this, you know, on Satan or whatever. And all the interesting things I found out were from the comic, and everything that wasn't interesting was not. So that's how I got into it. And yeah, I think you're spot on. The magic stuff is a lot less important in especially the earlier runs. I don't know. I haven't finished all 300 issues yet. I haven't read the Paul Milligan stuff or the Peter Milligan stuff. But yeah, up until your run specifically as well, there's barely any kind of magic like that where he's casting fireballs or doing, you know, scry magic to find out where he is and where something is. So yeah.
Okay. Well, I thought that John is the guy that can look the devil in the eye, and the devil blinks first, and that's what he can do. Beyond that, he doesn't do any of that stuff, you know. And it's interesting, you know. What is a little bit like watching. Sometimes I watch Inhumans, for example, and I thought that Jay and I had done well because Black Bolt, the main character, never speaks because he cannot speak. And so once they made the TV show and he could do sign language, I'm like, he can't speak, for God's sake. Like, that's literally the opposite of the point of the character. So I think that, I watched the TV show of Hellblazer and I thought, well, that's not what that's not what makes him compelling at all. The fact that he can conjure magic. So can Doctor Strange, and so can this character, and so can that. Like, that's boring after a while. Well, there you go. That's been like my experience. You guys are welcome to ask me any more questions, or we can it. It's all up to you.
Yeah, Hoku. I think you answered most of my stuff. Hoku, did you have anything?
I was actually wondering, since you had never done any writing before, did you have to figure out sort of like your way of how you wrote each issue, or did you like figure out like early on, like, okay, I'm gonna like do morning writing and then maybe go for a walk, and like what was your schedule like, and do you still like keep it to this day, or have you like refined it?
Well, I have run into something that is like confusing to me that I don't understand about other people, right? I hear a lot of people talk about like their schedule, and I hear a lot of other people talk about being blocked, writer's block, and I've never had it ever yet. Once
Nice.
I've found that when you talk about talent, am I talented as a writer? No, that's just a thing, right? That's just a lot of work and a lot of practice and a lot of understanding and confidence, maybe, right? But the two talents I have are weird. If I'm playing golf and someone hits a putt and it's going to go in no matter where it comes in, I'm like, that's in, and it goes in. I'm apparently really good at watching someone putt a golf ball. And the other talent I have is that I can start telling a story immediately, and probably it's halfway decent. I don't have any fear of it or worry about it. And what that means is I can have a task. I've written a screenplay in a day before, and but I don't want people to think I can write a screenplay every day. That's not how it works. So no, I never did. I would make sure of only one thing, that my book would be handed in before they needed it, so that I would be ahead of the artist every single month, so I could be a reliable person that they would give work to. I think that's probably the only thing I did.
Hmm.
That's always a good good thing in a writer for comics specifically, because
Yeah.
I think that's something that's fallen by the wayside. Single issues, like you said, being able to write one single issue that's a good solid story, and then also a writer who can make it on time and make it good, and then the artist has time to finish it and everything, and keep a good monthly schedule. That's something that's kind of fallen by the wayside as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah. Well, anything else, Hoku?
Yeah, I was actually wondering. So neither of us really knows much about Arthurian lore beyond like what we've seen in movies, or I've never even read the real story of King Arthur. And uh, I think one of the things that we found most confusing was how much Christianity was in the story, to where it was like, God had created this box, God
Totally get
was,
it. Yeah.
wanting to destroy Merlin and all of his creations. And then,
Yeah.
you know, what is that like really like a big part of the lore, or was that something you added?
I added that, but I remember you guys talking about. I remember you saying this, that you weren't sure about like Arthurian lore, and it wasn't really that
Yeah.
interesting to either of you, right? Both of you kind of. I seem to remember that both of you had said at one point. Am I right that you were sort of like, yeah, it's not really the thing that floats my boat the most, right? And I get
We'd
it,
only
right?
seen it in like cartoon
Yeah,
shows, and so we knew of King Arthur and the Round Table and Lancelot from movies and
yeah.
stuff, but
But
neither of
that
us was
stuff,
ever really like
yeah.
felt it in our soul.
The round table and all that kind of stuff, that's the Christian version of what he did. And they also he's gone searching for the cup of Joseph of Arimathea and all this stuff, right? And but it was drawn from the Mabinogion. And remember, my family are Welsh as well as English, right? And so the Mabinogion is really the story of Peredur. That's where you got Bran the Blessed, the head in the box, and all that other stuff.
Oh.
Um, and so the point of Arthurian legend, in a sense, especially if you're just talking about the search for the Grail, is that it's never about finding the Grail and having the magical Grail that can, like Indiana Jones, kind of like, you open the box and now you can magic everything, right? That was not the point even of the adaptation, because Arthurian legend is really an adaptation of the original Mabinogion stories, which are Celtic and Welsh, right?
Mm.
Uh, The story is not what you find. The story is that you go on a journey. That they do not, even the Christian version thereof is not about it. Even that says it's not finding the cup. It's finding it's finding yourself as you go searching, right? I mean, Monty Python and the Holy Grail kind of get it right.
Yeah, I mean,
right? It was,
it's about the journey.
And by the way, I'm going to leave you guys with I think what I'll do is I'll leave you with a great anecdote that makes you go like, man, I kind of get Paul Jenkins now, right? Because I think I might be the most interesting person in the world, right? Which isn't that great because there's a Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. Remind me to tell you my Terry Jones anecdote, which is worth it.
Okay.
So yeah, to wrap that one up, I think that what I wanted to write about was this betrayal of what was really in the country by Christianity and an establishment. Because I have no issue with Christianity. If you ask me to talk about Jesus Christ, I'll probably say what a lovely person that was. Amazing person, a rebel, pissed off the Romans, got killed by his own people. Now the question of his divinity being the Son of God, that's a different thing altogether, right? I'm not really a Christian or a religious person. So people can believe that he's the Son of God, and that's fine, as long as you don't do shitty things in the name of Jesus, which apparently everybody has chosen to do now, right? But where I came from, and I mentioned this earlier in our conversation, I came from a pagan background in the country. My brother will go on the solstice to here. So will I. I will, go and burn a Yule log. I will just, but I'm not a religious person, so I don't really do much paganism, except that we were raised in it. And so that story that you see about Arthurian legend and Myrddin, which is Merlin, is more likely, it's more about like, we had every right, Myrddin had every right to be upset that God had abandoned him as some kind of Christian thing when they were the original chosen, and now suddenly they've been abandoned. Because a lot of what I was saying was about like how Britain, the country, had been abandoned by, because what do you see if people say to me all the time, oh, you're from London? Oh, do you know Mrs. Smith in London? Oh, the BBC's in London. Everything's in London because it's all London centric. Well, try telling that to my brother in Somerset, who just took the family down to the Somerset Mid-Central Fair and ran around on the swings with the little girl and threw coconuts at a store and just, grew the biggest vegetable and stuff. Like, that's part of our life too. Always has been. So that story was not just about Arthurian legend. It was about how the real story had been betrayed by a Christian version that was used to subvert what the real story was all about. It was about paganism. It was about how paganism is seen as being some kind of devilish thing. Oliver Cromwell started it by saying, you guys are great. Americans are fantastic. I came over and you guys did Halloween. I was like, what the fuck are you doing? This is great. You guys get drunk on Halloween, because it's just it was created by the Germans and it was created by Oliver Cromwell to say, oh yeah, that night that they all like to celebrate, that's evil. That's when the witches come out. Right. But it was never that. That was just it was like halfway between Harvest Festival and Midwinter. Right. And so it was just like this thing where you kind of take recognition of your stuff. And so they would like burn fires and they would do that. And then Cromwell was like, that's evil because it's not Christian. Let's kill them all. Right. So it's just that story was much more of a rebellion it was more of me saying like, man, the Christians establishment took all these things from the country and just eradicated them. That's why Merlin is pissed off that they built a road all the way through Stonehenge, because we were really pissed off when it happened. So I think it's about all of that stuff, which is a bit harder for you guys to see maybe because I wasn't that explicit about it. I was just writing about it, Right.
Well, but I like that. I like when you read a writer and you are like, I'm not like I'm understanding a chunk of this, but there's something that I don't know that I just need a little piece of knowledge that's out of my grasp. And then eventually I figure it out, and then I'm like, oh, it clicks. And now I have all, like, now I get the full story. And that's when I read all your back matter. I'm like, his whole run is clicking now. Everything makes so much more sense. And, that was, now I need to go back and reread all of it and be like, oh, now I fully grasp everything.
There's this funny thing that happened to me where I live. I live in Georgia. I live north of Atlanta. And, you know, some of the prevailing theories up here are still tied to the sort of South shall rise again kind of crap, right? Mm-hmm. And I got a text from a buddy of mine who I play golf with, who's a very funny guy. And he said, have you seen Nextdoor? And I don't know what Nextdoor is, because me and the internet have a love-hate relationship, and I don't really care about it, but I do my best. And apparently Nextdoor is this group where your neighborhood people will go on and post, I saw a fox this morning, or what they don't. They go on and they talk about bloody politics, and, you know, people come on and say, well, screw you because, you know, I hate Donald Trump. Well, I hate you too. And off they go, right? So apparently this old boy in our neighborhood had seen that I had a ladder outside the front of my house. And I just put it up in the morning because I was cleaning my gutters. And he said, that ladder's been there for 5 days. It's unsightly and all that. And I'm like, what? And so my buddy, who's a very funny guy, said, oh, no. He wrote into Nextdoor and he said, no, that's not what's happening. I happen to know that family's a lovely family of druids from England. And they're getting ready for midsummer. And they want to see the sunrise, and so they will get themselves ready. And I'm like, my mate Mike Crumley, I'm like, Crumley, that's the greatest joke. So I signed on to Nextdoor. I signed up for it, and I put my avatar as a picture of King Arthur from Holy Grail, from Monty Python. And then on the 21st in the morning, I got up, I got on my roof, and I sat legs crossed with my arms up, and I meditated for about 5 hours. And I happen to live where there's a stop sign, and so people drive up the hill and they go, oh my God, there are druids there. Right? And that was approximately 18 years ago, and I've done it every year since. I do that same joke. And people write in. Someone wrote in and they were like, I want to drink with a druid and find out what it's all about. Another guy like, oh God, no, you're just like the Muslims or something.
They're invading.
I face racial hatred just for being a bloody druid. It's fantastic. So it's kind of what I meant about living life. I think that the funniest parts of life is I can see the way that humans are by doing something like that and then sitting back and watching and see what they have to say. I'm not a druid, and I'm not sitting on my roof for any reason except to watch what you say on Nextdoor, because this is fascinating. You know,
totally worth it.
It's totally worth it. So, you know, I was going to leave you with a couple of anecdotes, but I've got one for you. I think it's worth it, so that you can see that it's funny being like me and having this connection with my mum and living life as opposed to watching it on TV. Right? When I first went to LA, it was the day that the Northridge earthquakes happened. And I've flown in from England, but I'm flying in to pitch a new TV show with Kevin Eastman, one of the two creators, and we've created this TV show. I'm exhausted. I've flown to the East Coast. Now I've flown to the West Coast. I don't know what time of day it is. I'm so tired, but I've flown into the sun. So now it's probably 3 o'clock in the morning as far as I'm concerned, but it's like, you know, 6 in the evening as far as America is concerned, right? And so, you know, it's probably 1991, 1992, whenever that Northridge earthquake. And so I land and the earthquakes happen. And I'm like, wow, they do have a lot of earthquakes in California. Because I think this is normal. Like, and the ground is like jelly. And I have no idea what's happening. And I'm probably 23, 24. And so the ground's going off, and Kevin says to me, hey, do you want to come to the Playboy Mansion tonight? And I'm like, no, man, I'm not interested. He's like, how are you not interested in coming to the Playboy Mansion? And I'm like, because I'm tired, man. I'm exhausted. And he's like, well, I'm going. So he goes to the Playboy Mansion. Now, Meanwhile, because there's so much money in the Ninja Turtles, we're staying at a place called the Sunset Marquee, and this is the most expensive and exclusive thing. And I've got a suite, right? I have literally 3 rooms to myself because Kevin swung for these 3 rooms because there's a lot of money. And I'm like, oh, at least I got somewhere to hang, you know. So I go to the bar, and Bill Maher is in there with Ian Astbury, the lead singer of the Cult, who's wearing black contact lenses. And me and Bill Maher and Ian Astbury are literally wobbling around because the aftershocks keep coming, and we're drinking and going, this is crazy. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, what do you do? And I'm like, I'm with the Ninja Turtles. They're like, good enough, you can hang, right? So I go to bed, and I don't know what's happening. I wake up super early because now I'm on British time, and I wake up and I walk out, and there's basically, I kid you not, Roger Moore, who was James Bond for a while, is sitting 5 feet away from me, and Bruce Springsteen, avid his eggs and bacon, sitting right next to me. And there's a starlet in the pool at 7 o'clock in the morning. She's already trying to be seen, you know, and I'm like, you know, like. So Kevin Eastman comes in, and he goes, Paul, you never guess who I ran into at the Playboy Mansion last time. I'm like, what? He goes, Terry Jones from Monty Python, man. Now, Kevin's super excited because he loves Monty Python and he loves Terry Jones. And so he gets talking to Terry, and they've had a great night. And he says, yeah, he's staying here at the hotel. This is the great story. So lo and behold, Terry Jones walks in a little while later, and Kevin goes, hey, Terry, come over here. So he walks over, and he has breakfast with us. And Kevin goes, hey, Terry, I want to introduce you to my friend Paul. And I said, hello, Terry, you live next door to my mum. And Terry Jones goes, what? And I go, yeah, you live in Llanidlos, right, in mid-central Wales, miles from anywhere. I said, do you know Hazel from the pub? And he says, are you Hazel's boy? A week before I met Terry Jones, my mum had called me from England. She said, you never guess who moved in down the road from me? Terry Jones from Monty Python. The story gets better. So she'd seen him down the pub, and she'd seen him at the laundrette, and she said his wife was lovely, and she got to know him because my mum will know, everyone will remember Hazel, my mum. So now I'm in freaking Sunset Marquee in Hollywood, and I'm being introduced to Terry Jones, and I go, yeah, you know my mum? And he goes, oh my God, are you Hazel's boy? Now he doesn't want to talk to anybody, he wants to talk to me, and he wants to talk to me about Llanidlos. Kevin is devastated because Terry doesn't care. Kevin doesn't care about Roger Moore, doesn't care about Bruce Springsteen. He wants to talk to me about Llanidlos because the Python guys never liked America, and they never liked American agents. So we get to talking, and Terry goes, yeah, I came into town yesterday, he said, and you never get this. And he's sort of like all conspiratorial about it. He says, yeah, he goes, I get off the plane, and they pick me up in a limo at the airport. And they get in, and the bloody agent gets in. Now, the Pythons hated American agents. They hated them. And he goes, yeah. And the agent goes, okay, so we're off to ABC. And Terry's tired. He's what? He goes, yeah, have you got it with you? And all Terry can work out is apparently they've promised ABC that Terry Jones has come over from Britain to pitch him a new show. And Terry has never been told this. He has no idea. So he goes to me, yeah. And he goes, so I just made it up on the spot. He goes, I just made up something, and they bought it. Can you believe it? I'm like, that's fantastic, Derek. Brilliant. The thing he made up was called Blazing Dragons. And he said, yeah, what I did was I made the dragons the good guys, and all the knights and all of that the bad guys. I figured knights, they would like Holy Grail, and they bought it, and now they want to do it. And I'm like, okay, great, cool. Couple of years later, minding my own business, maybe a year later, I'm minding my own business. I'm at home in Northampton, Massachusetts, and I'm writing, and I get a phone call, and they're like, hey, is this Paul Jenkins? Yeah. Well, we're from Crystal Dynamics in San Francisco. We like your work, blah, blah, blah. I think you've worked on a couple of video games. How would you feel about working on a game? It was created by Terry Jones of Monty Python. I'm like, do tell. He goes, yeah, it's called Blazing Dragons. I'm like, that's funny. I said, I know Terry. He knows my mum. Now, at this point, I'm writing emails to Terry occasionally, and he's a big student of history, and he knows my mum, and every so often I'd write to him, and he's a nice guy, and he's very kind to me. And so I start writing this, but I write to Terry, fucking hell, Terry, you can't believe this. That I got a call from them. I'm working on your bloody video game. He's like, you kidding me, right? So we start like joking. But he hadn't done much of the work except except, a little bit of it, and they did the animated series. So I got on with the work. And about a year later, I'd stopped working on it, and I get this phone call, and they're like, "Hey, is this Paul Jenkins?" "Yeah." Paul, I understand that you know Terry Jones from Monty Python." I was like, "Well, my mum does." Right? And they go, "Yeah, well, we can't get through his agent because we want him." And I'm like, "Yeah, he hates his agent." Like, I know. And they go, I wondered if you could do me a favor. Is there any chance you could get in touch with him? Because we want him to do the voiceovers for the game, but we can't get through his agent. And I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll do what I can." So I called up my mum and I said, "Hey, Mum, can you go down the pub to see if Terry's down there? Because they want him to do the voiceovers." So she went down the pub. He found him. He called, and he ended up doing the voiceovers because of my mum.
That's brilliant.
And so when people ask me, where does it all come from? I'm like, well, it comes from living, and it doesn't come from watching television. And I think that's pretty much the way that proves it,
Yes. That is
That's amazing.
a great story and a great little message to end on. Go live life. Don't stay inside. You'll have adventures that you could tell stories
You never
like
know
that.
who you're going to meet.
Yeah, yeah.
You never know.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. This was amazing, and the fact that you reached out just made my whole year pretty much. So, thank you so much again, and everybody go buy the omnibus of Paul Jenkins and Sean Phillips. Yeah, it's amazing. You can read all the back matter. It's worth it for sure. And anything else you want to plug or promote?
A couple of things. Obviously, we are recording on the 18th of August, 2026. That's actually when we're recording it. Tonight, there's a teaser going out, and tomorrow morning, there will be a big announcement. So the next project that I'm doing at Marvel is probably something that people will be pretty excited for because I've been there before. So there's a big announcement tomorrow morning. But what more than anything, I would say this. I love what you guys do. I really do. I think it's great. When someone comes dressed as a Sentry, I'm always like, this is cool. Last year at Dragon Con in Atlanta, 30 people came as Bob. One came as the Sentry, one came as the Void. And they were so excited because it meant something to them. Mm-hmm. So I think I would turn it around and not necessarily say what I'm doing. I would say to people listening to this, support this podcast because you guys do something that's worthwhile. It's why I reached out, right? The communities and the fans and the people that take the time to do the podcast and all that kind of stuff is actually the lifeblood of creativity. So I'm lucky because I get to put the work out and people read it and they judge it. And sometimes it doesn't feel so lucky when they're yelling at me. And sometimes it doesn't feel so lucky when I'm tired and I don't want to do it, right? But I am because I have a body of work. But what I think is really important in all of these bodies of work is having this opportunity, especially because of the internet, at least use the internet as a tool that it's intended to be, which is to connect as a community. Don't yell about politics. Don't get involved in some angry conversation about your chosen politician of the day, because they're a shithead. But follow this podcast, listen to other podcasts, go live, go do something interesting and join in together in all of this, because there is no politics in this podcast. It's Hellblazer. There is no stupidity in this, so I think it's this. I think, yeah, I've got work coming out and I can promote it, but I much rather promote you guys and people like you, because I think this is what makes things work for us.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and just so you know, I get people, listeners that write to me and say, you reading Hellblazer to people, it made my whole life. I've even got people say, you saved my life just because I'm reading your work, so thank you so much for that and for everything you've written. And, it means a lot to a lot of people. And, I can't wait to read your new stuff. So, all right. Well, with that, we'll see you guys on the next one.
Bye, guys.
Bye.